Chapter 18. The little boy popped his head out from Princess Li Yu's side and looked over curiously. He sniffled and buried his head in Song Song's arms. He rubbed his face randomly, and the mucus on his face was smeared on Song Song's clothes. Li Yu took out her handkerchief and wiped the little boy clumsily. She did not show any disgust on her face. She then turned to Ning Ke and said indifferently, "Follow me when we reach Chang'an. I will give you a good future." Ning Ke had already guessed the identity of this little brute boy, but he did not expect the princess to love her stepson so much. Especially the little action of wiping the little boy's nose, it had changed his impression of Her Highness slightly. As he thought about these things, his reaction was inevitably slower. He was slightly startled and replied, "Your Highness, I will participate in the Academy's entrance exam after I reach Chang'an." Humans could interpret the same sentence in different ways. This sentence could be interpreted as Ning Ke saying that he did not have time to serve Her Highness, or it could be interpreted as a euphemistic refusal. There was even a little pride in it. "I will have a good future once I enter the Academy, and Her Highness does not need to worry about me. Are you sure that you can successfully participate in the entrance exam and pass it?" Li Yu looked at him coldly and said, "Although the Tang Empire selects people based on their talents, the word selection is very particular. If you think that talented people can find a place to display their talents, Mr. Liu of the previous dynasty would not have been living in a brothel all his life." Ning Ke looked at her delicate brows and said seriously, "I also understand this, so I'm begging you to help me get rid of those obstacles that shouldn't exist. I only hope that I won't lose the opportunity to enter the academy because of my poverty." Li Yu looked at him with undisguised suspicion and was silent for a long time. She could not understand why this young soldier would so calmly and directly reject her invitation. After all, she was the fourth princess of the Tang Empire who was most favored by the emperor and the people. With Ning Ke's current identity and status, it was already a blessing that he had cultivated for 8 lifetimes to be able to have such a close contact with her. If it were any other soldier from the border town, even if they were qualified to participate in the academy entrance exam of the academy, who wouldn't be moved to tears and worship her when they received her recognition? After a long silence, she said indifferently, "I promise you, because I owe you this." After saying this, she lost interest in talking to Ning Quebec. She held the little boy and stared at the bonfire in front of her. Her eyes gradually became wet. At this time, Liu Qingchen was sitting cross-legged next to the bonfire to meditate and recover. On the other side, the bodyguards had already fallen asleep. The night was deep and the birds were occasionally awakened by the stars and carelessly chirped. Ning Ke looked at the crystal color in her eyes in surprise. He followed her gaze and found that she was looking at a pile of bodyguards and grassland barbarians' bodies by the road. Thinking of her wiping the little boy's nose and seeing her sad feelings for her subordinates, Ning Ke's impression of the princess changed again. He silently thought that even if she was an idiot, she was still an idiot with humanity. Sang Sang fell asleep on his knees. Only he and Li Yu were still awake by the bonfire. The two of them sat quietly. Suddenly, the little brute boy struggled out of her arms. He rubbed his eyes and said that he couldn't sleep and wanted to listen to a story. Li Yu looked embarrassed. She thought that she had long forgotten the stories she had heard in the palace when she was young. How could she tell the novels about scholars and beautiful women that she loved to listen to when she was a young girl to a child? The little barbarian boy did not make a noise. He just looked at his nominal mother pitifully and unwillingly. Ning Ke looked at the embarrassed princess with a smile and gently coughed twice. The wheat was golden, and the oats were green. The duck eggs cracked one by one, but the biggest egg didn't move at all. The mother duck looked at the big and ugly baby and watched it swimming happily in the water. She said proudly, "Look, it's not a hateful turkey, it's my baby. But it is too ugly. No matter where it goes, people will point at it." The wild duck said that as long as you don't marry the ducks of our tribe, it has nothing to do with us. One night, when the beautiful sun was setting in the west of the wilderness, the ugly duckling saw a flock of big birds flying out of the woods. The ugly duckling had never seen such beautiful things. They were white and shiny, with long and soft necks. They spread their beautiful wings and flew to the warm country. After a winter, the ugly duckling was surrounded by several swans. It felt ashamed. It felt so ugly, but the swans gently pecked its feathers. It suddenly saw how beautiful it was in the pool. Spring came. The sun was very warm. The lilacs hung their branches in the water in front of the ugly duckling. People watched the ugly duckling dance and sing happily. They shouted happily, "Look at that beautiful swan." Ning Kai took a piece of charred wood and casually drew lines on the ground beside his feet. He lowered his head and told a very old story with a smile. The story was so simple, but so sad and happy. The little barbarian boy lay on the princess's body and listened with wide eyes. Li Yu also gradually became absorbed in the story. Sang Sang woke up. She had heard the story when she was very young, but she still listened quietly with a childish smile on her face. The night grew darker. After listening to the story, the children finally fell asleep. After a long silence, Li Yu suddenly said, "Your story is too profound. Xiao Man can't understand it. But I still want to thank you for reminding me of these things. I will treat him as my own child like the mother duck. I will be proud of him. When I return to Chang'an, I will never let him be laughed at or discriminated against by others. As for whether he can soar like a swan in the future, it depends on his own fate." Ning Kai scratched his head and smiled. He said, "Actually, I didn't think so much. This is a story I told to Sang Sang when she was young. She always felt that she was black and ugly and felt very inferior. So I made up this story to comfort her. No matter what, it is a good story." Li Yu looked at him with a smile and said, "The ugly duckling that was looked down upon by others finally became a white swan that was respected and loved by others through his own efforts. It is very inspiring." Ning Kai's hand that was holding the charred wood slightly stiffened. He looked up at her and said seriously, "You are wrong. This story will only make many people feel desperate. Because the ugly duckling will not become a swan. It is originally a swan. Just like your highness and the little prince in your arms. And the real ugly duckling will always be an ugly duckling." Li Yu quietly looked at the boy's face and thought about this paragraph. She vaguely understood something in her heart. Chapter 19. This seemingly meaningful dialogue derived from a fairy tale seemed to have plunged into the lake of life and was about to turn into dregs. However, if one were to think about it carefully, once the two people who were having the conversation took off the clothes of the noble princess and the woodcutter of Shubi Lake, they were actually just a boy and a girl of about 15 or 17 years old. In some extreme environments, such as an icehouse at the bottom of a well, young people often forgot their identity and responsibilities or something else, and became much purer. Beside the bonfire on the northern mountain road, which had just gone through a bloody battle, Li Yu and Ning Kai, the princess of Tang dynasty, became simple storytellers and storytellers. Because the wounded people around them were sleeping, the storytellers lowered their voices. In order to hear the story clearly, the storytellers had to get closer. Because of this, they naturally sat together, shoulder to shoulder, beside the bonfire, chatting some meaningless gossip until they fell asleep. After a long time, the night gradually faded, and the stars gave way to the morning light above the treetops. From the south of the northern mountain road came the faint sound of horse hooves. Liu Qingchen and Ning Kai opened their eyes at the same time, looked at each other, and then woke up their companions around them. A grassland barbarian crouched on the ground and listened. After a while, he raised his right hand and made a gesture, clenched his fist, and then quickly fanned it, indicating to his companions that there were a lot of people coming from the south, and they were heavily armored cavalry. The bonfire was about to go out, and gray ash fell from the charred wood, with some sparks remaining. The bodyguards and grassland barbarians struggled to get up, took out the military crossbows they had prepared, and aimed at the still dark northern mountain road. They were so badly injured that they could not move quickly, and since they knew that the enemies were powerful, there was no need to hide. All they needed to do was to wait calmly, to be rescued, or to die in the battle. The fallen leaves on the northern mountain road were rolled up by the strong wind, and in the dim light, dozens of cavalrymen rushed out. The cavalrymen and horses were wrapped in extremely thick black armor, and they were running at such a fast speed that the ground trembled like thunder, and the ashes in the bonfire were shaken up, like the morning smoke. The most elite black-armored cavalrymen of the Tang Empire. Once a group of cavalrymen clad in heavy armor launched a charge on the battlefield, it would be difficult to find a match for them. Even powerful great swordsmen would not be able to cause effective damage to these heavily armored cavalrymen. However, the crowd could clearly see that the heavily armored cavalrymen had clear arrow wounds and saber marks on their bodies. It was obvious that they had been attacked, and they might have been ambushed in the southern foothills. Under such circumstances, the heavily armored cavalrymen, who were not suitable for forest combat, still had to cross the northern mountain road overnight. It could be imagined that they were anxious. Dozens of armored black cavalrymen rushed out of the northern mountain road. When they were about 300 feet away from the two bonfires, the young knight in the front, wearing armor and a red cloak, looked at the people around the bonfires and shouted, "Hua Shangyue of Gushan Commandery is here. Where is His Highness?" Hearing Hua Shanyue's name, the guard who was holding the crossbow instantly relaxed his vigilance and replied loudly. Ning Ke looked down at Princess Liu, who was leaning against his shoulder. He saw her eyelashes moving slightly, as if she was about to wake up. He could not help but raise his eyebrows with a smile and silently put away the boxwood bough in his left hand. Like lightning hammering, the horses' hooves broke through the northern mountain road at high speed, rolling up or crushing the fallen leaves. The young general, who called himself Hua Shanyue, patted the saddle and flew down from the horse. He quickly ran to the bonfires and knelt down on one knee. He clasped his fists and said in a hoarse voice, "Shanyue's rescue was late. He deserves to die. Please forgive him, Your Highness." At this time, dozens of black-armored cavalrymen rushed into the forest. The exhausted elite cavalrymen of the Tang Empire dismounted and knelt behind Hua Shanyue. They said in unison, "Please forgive him, Your Highness." Li Yu opened her eyes. It seemed that she had just woken up, or perhaps, she had been awake for a long time. She looked at Hua Shanyue, the commandant of the Gushan Commandery, who was kneeling in front of her. She looked at the young general who was loyal to her, and the cavalrymen who had obviously experienced bloody battles to get here. Her eyes were full of encouragement. She smiled and said, "Get up quickly. Do you really want me to punish you?" She was very happy. These cavalrymen of the Tang Empire, who had been ambushed at the southern foot of the northern mountain road and worried about her life, finally saw the virtuous princess again after a year. How could they not be excited? Hua Shanyue raised his head excitedly and was about to say something. But he saw the princess sitting on the shoulder of a young soldier with a particularly natural expression. Seeing this scene, his heart tightened for some reason. There was a trace of surprise and displeasure in his eyes, and he frowned slightly. Ning Ke, who had been watching the black-armored cavalryman, saw the young general's face clearly the moment he raised his head. It was a handsome face with sword-like eyebrows, which added a bit of heroic spirit. At such a young age, he was already the commandant of the Gushan Commandery and commanded a whole black-armored cavalry. Hua Shanyue was undoubtedly the most outstanding figure among the young generation of the Tang Empire. He was the best in both shrewdness and ability. It was a pity that he had always been unable to cross a threshold in his life. A few years ago, he even fell over this threshold. This threshold was the love that he had buried deep in his heart, but had long been known by all of the Tang Empire. It was the deepest and most passionate love for Her Highness Liu, the fourth princess of the Tang Empire. Hua Shanyue's sudden and slightly cold mood was not aimed at Liu. Even if he killed him, he would not dare to disrespect the princess. He just hated the young soldier beside Her Highness very much. Who are you? How dare you be so close to Her Highness's noble body? Not too close, but already touching. He had never been so close to Her Highness's fragrant shoulder in his life. He had never enjoyed such a wonderful treatment in his life. If possible, he wanted to take out his sword and cut off the young soldier's shoulder. Hua Shangyue hid this kind of jealousy and coldness very well, at least in front of Her Highness. So Li Yu only saw a flash of surprise and displeasure in his eyes. She was slightly startled, and then felt the warmth from her arm. Only then did she understand why the young general had a strange look in his eyes. She subconsciously raised her hand to tidy up her hair to hide her embarrassment. She did not expect to spend a night with Ning Ke by the fire, side by side. Although it was the situation, for the princess of the Tang Empire, it was indeed inappropriate to be so intimate with a young man. Princess Li Yu slowly stood up. So the maidservant who listened to the story no longer existed. The remaining warmth between the two of them was quickly blown away by the morning wind. After a moment of silence, Ning Ke shook his head and smiled. Looking at her profile, he suddenly felt that her eyes and brows were exceptionally beautiful when the morning light shone on her cheeks. She was much cuter than on the journey a few days ago. Cold and proud, of course, was not as beautiful as calm and graceful. But he still felt that the girl under the firelight was the most beautiful. Chapter 20. Hua Shangyue looked around the dense forest, only then did he notice that there were many enemies in the forest, and there were many corpses from both sides. Looking at the blood and the traces of battle, especially after he took the thin hiltless sword, he finally understood how tragic the battle last night was, and his expression couldn't help but change slightly. He signaled his subordinates to prepare the horse and said, "Your Highness, the reinforcement team is already on the way. We should leave quickly." Princess Li Yu nodded and agreed with his arrangement. She walked away under the heavy protection of the cavalry. At this time, Hua Shangyue coldly glanced at Ning Ke beside the fire. There was no emotion in his eyes, which made people feel cold. He was guessing the real relationship between this young soldier and Her Highness. However, no matter how he thought about it, he felt that this soldier could not pose any threat to him, so his eyes became more and more indifferent. The indifference in his eyes actually hid many possibilities. Ning Ke was very clear about this. He quietly looked at Hua Shanyue's back and thought of the passion and tenderness in his eyes. He knew that he would not harm the idiot princess, but it seemed that his possessiveness was too strong. The young general's fanatical love for Her Highness had nothing to do with a soldier like Ning Quebec. However, Ning Ke did not like the indifference in Hua Shanyue's last glance. He knew that this kind of indifference meant that he was powerful and could kill at any time. It also meant that he did not care about the princess. Ning Ke did not like it, so he stood up and looked at the girl who was about to get on the horse. He raised his chin and smiled. "Your Highness, actually I have something to say to you since we were in the city of Wei." Hua Shanyue suddenly looked back. In the morning light, the beautiful princess on the white horse turned around with a frown. She quietly looked at the young soldier beside the fire and seemed to want to scold him. In the end, she just said lightly, "Let's talk about it when we return to Chang'an." Before leaving, Hua Shanyue asked the bodyguard leader in a low voice. He roughly understood what the princess had encountered since she entered the country. He also knew about Ning Ke's performance in the assassination last night. He was silent for a moment and walked to Ning Quebec. He said calmly, "You have made a great contribution this time. The imperial court will reward you when we return to Chang'an." "Well done, little guy." Ning Ke took Sang Sang to the shabby tent on the slope to pack his luggage. Sang Sang awkwardly tied the big black umbrella on her back again. Suddenly, she raised her sharp chin and frowned at Ning Quebec. She asked confusedly, "Young master, did you deliberately say, you have something to say?" "Yeah. Ning Kai scraped the coagulated blood off the blade and answered casually, Hua Shangyue is too hypocritical and boring. I don't like him, so I have to make him unhappy. Young master, what were you going to say to Her Royal Highness? Sang Sang stopped what she was doing and asked curiously. How would I know? Ning Kai sheathed his knife, looked at her and shrugged. He said, anyway, I can't say that I've been deeply in love with you since the first day I saw you in the city of Wei, but Commandant Hua might think so, and His Highness might really think that you want to say this. It's not surprising that idiots have idiotic ideas. Ning Kai replied. The little handmaiden looked into his eyes seriously and said, do you feel that you are sometimes very bored? Ning Kai tilted his head to show that he agreed. Sang Sang shook her head and looked at him again after a while. She asked, young master, is it that in your eyes, everyone else in the world is an idiot except for you? Ning Kai thought seriously while tying the scabbard. After a long time, he answered seriously, this problem is not about me. It's that there are always many idiots in the world doing idiotic things. A man like Hua Shangyue is not an idiot, but he actually believes in love, which makes him an idiot. Sang Sang pointed at her nose with her index finger and asked seriously, am I also an idiot in your eyes? Ning Kai looked at the tanned little face and answered seriously, you're not an idiot. You're just stupid. Before they left the northern mountain road, a small episode happened. The Gushan Commandery cavalry left a few cavalrymen to guard the scene. The men of sacrifice who dared to assassinate the Princess of Tang would not leave any clues, so they were not here to investigate the case, but to protect the corpses. After the main force arrived, all the corpses would be transported back to Chang'an for burial. It was the iron rule of the Tang army not to leave a comrade, dead or alive. The corpses of their comrades were carefully placed in the forest, while the corpses of the enemies were randomly piled on the ground, waiting to be burned into ashes. When it was the turn to deal with the body of the middle-aged scholar in cyan robe, the cavalrymen were in a dilemma. They knew that he was a great sword master, so they didn't know whether they should show respect to him. Hua Shangyue slightly frowned and decided to bury the great sword master. At this moment, Liu Qingchen whispered to them, this man has joined the diabolism. Hearing the word diabolism, the young general's face turned serious. When he looked at the corpse wrapped in cyan robe again, there was no longer any respect, but only disdain. He waved his hand like shooing away a fly and said, throw it in and burn it. They drove out of the southern exit of the northern mountain road in the early morning and met with the main force of the Gushan Commandery at noon. Under the heavy protection of hundreds of elite cavalrymen, the fourth princess of Tang, Li Yu, and her team continued to march to the capital Chang'an. At this time, neither the Tang Empire or the enemies from other countries could threaten her safety. For the next few days, Li Yu and the little prince of the barbarian tribe stayed in the carriage and did not appear in front of the public. Although there were hundreds of light cavalrymen escorting them, the surviving bodyguards and grassland barbarians still insisted on riding their horses and guarding around the carriages regardless of their injuries. The old man Liu Qingchen was in the second carriage, and the heavily injured bodyguards and barbarians were in the carriages behind. As for Ning Kai and his little handmaiden Sang Sang, they were sitting in their own shabby carriage and lagging far behind. At the border of the Gushan Commandery, all the heavy cavalrymen were replaced by light cavalrymen, so the team suddenly sped up. Those sturdy carriages in the front could still keep up, but Ning Kai and his handmaiden's carriage seemed to be struggling. A cavalryman galloped to their carriage and scolded angrily, "You are too slow. Hurry up." Just like the first few days after they left the city of Wei, Ning Kai felt sleepy sitting on the shaft of the carriage. He looked like he was about to fall down at any time, and Sang Sang was holding him up by his side. Hearing the angry scolding of the cavalryman, he opened his eyes and glanced at him without saying a word. Looking at the back of the cavalryman, Sang Sang wiped the 2 or 3 beads of sweat on her forehead, squinted her willow-like eyes and said, "Young master, we seem to be despised." Despised is a good word. If you use the word forgotten, it would be too sour and flirtatious. Ning Ke glanced at the carriage in the front and thought of the princess who had never shown her face again. He said with a smile, "For poor guys like us who have to work hard to survive, any kind of sour and flirtatious feelings are disgusting." Sitting side by side with the princess by the fire for a night of fairy tales, this kind of scene seemed so dreamy no matter in Chang'an or on the grassland. That kind of scene was a real fairy tale, not real. A small soldier from the border town saved a noble by chance, got the corresponding reward, and then never contacted the heavenly earth again. This was the real story in the real world. There were heroic epics in this world, but there were no fairy tales. If Romeo was not the son of a noble but a dung digger, Juliet would have a much more intense psychological struggle when she died for him. Ning Ke had always thought that he had a clear understanding of this kind of thing. He knew that the profile of the girl by the fire was just a fake image, and the most important thing was that he had never really fallen in love with her. He just appreciated that such a girl also had such a moment, so he did not have any feelings in his heart. After replenishing the supplies in the Guxian commandery, the team did not take a break but chose to continue all the way south. It seemed that Her Highness was really eager to return to Chang'an and return to her father who loved her dearly. Hua Shangyue should also know Ning Ke's background and knew that he was just the most common soldier from the border town, so he naturally would not really misunderstand that there was anything between Ning Ke and the princess, so Ning Ke was not troubled by the Guxian commandery. After setting up camp and resting, Sang Sang went to the river to fetch water, wash rice and slaughter fish, and made a very sumptuous dinner. The master and the handmaiden put the main dish into the rice bowl, and then ate happily with a few pickled cabbages and chili. They ate until they were sweating profusely and felt comfortable. A man with a cold face came in and looked at the scene in front of him. He shook his head and smiled. "We asked you to go there and eat from the same pot, but you refused. We thought you were resentful. Now it seems that you think the food over there is too bad. I really don't know how many lifetimes you have such a capable little handmaiden." Such a compliment was a bit too much for a lowly handmaiden. But Sang Sang did not feel anything. She smiled and continued to eat. Ning Ke, on the other hand, took it for granted. The man was called Peng Guotao, the Tang bodyguard leader who performed well in the bloody battle on the northern mountain road, and was deeply trusted by the princess. However, he had followed the princess into the grassland for a year with his subordinates, and encountered a series of bloody battles after returning home. Now there were only 7 loyal subordinates left, and this leader's mood must be very complicated and sad. They were comrades who had gone through life and death together on the northern mountain road, and the friendship forged by blood was much more solid than ordinary friendship. Ning Ke's performance in the battle must have been engraved in the minds of the people present. Therefore, these days the horse carriage that the Guxian commandery cavalry despised often received Peng Guotao and the other bodyguards as guests. The grassland barbarians also brought some hard liquor to Ning Ke and his handmaiden, but they were rarely willing to be within 100 feet of him, and rarely talked to him. It was unknown whether it was because of the legend of Shubi Lake. "I know there is no problem for you to go to the capital on your own, and indeed it is not very comfortable for you to go with the cavalry. But after I reported your request, there has been no reply." Peng Guotao looked at him and said apologetically, "You are sent by the city of Wei, and without the permission of Her Highness, you can't go." Ning Ke scratched his head and said, "Then I will follow them for a while." The journey to Chang'an seemed to pass without any surprises, dangers, and boring. However, on the second night, Ning Ke suddenly received an invitation from the second horse carriage. Liu Qingchen wanted to see him. Ning Ke was a little surprised and happy at the same time. He frowned and thought for a long time, and then decided not to think about anything else. He put out the fire next to the carriage with the fish porridge in the bowl, and then walked forward with Sang Sang. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, and the dim light shone warmly. Liu Qingchen, the Psyche master, looked at Ning Ke and the handmaiden respectfully bowing to him, and felt a little surprised. He thought to himself that this lad should know why he asked him to get on the carriage. Wasn't he worried that he would be unwilling to answer his questions because of the presence of a third person? The old man suddenly remembered the story that he had heard by the fire at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road that night, the story that he could not help but want to hear even when he was meditating. The story of a little boy and a little girl carrying bows and arrows on their backs, desperately surviving in the vast Min Mountain. He thought that he understood the reason why Ning Kai took Sang Sang with him, so he was relieved and found this lad even more pleasing to the eye. In fact, Ning Kai did not think too much about it. Taking Sang Sang with him was just a deep-rooted habit. The old man clasped his hands on his knees and said gently, "You should know very well why I came to see you." Ning Kai was silent. He pressed his left hand on the back of his right hand, and then pressed it on the floor in front of him. He knelt down on his knees and slowly leaned forward, touching the back of his left hand with his forehead, and made the most solemn bow in the empire. Although the old man Liu Qingchen had not done anything yet, and it was highly likely that the old man would not be able to help him either, because that was a world that only the truly abnormal geniuses could reach. However, only people like Ning Kai, who had been reading the article on the response of the Tao since he was a child, could understand the compassion and generosity of a cultivator who was willing to give guidance to an ordinary person who obviously had no potential. Seeing Ning Kai's solemn bow, Sang Sang hurriedly moved her knees to the old man and kowtowed to him, although she did not understand the young master's action. Seeing this scene, the old man Liu Qingchen could not help but stroke his beard and smile. He then helped Ning Kai up, collected his thoughts, closed his eyes, and put his two withered palms on Ning Kai's chest and back. After a while, the warm light of the oil lamp in the carriage became somewhat blurred, as if there were countless extremely tiny dust particles flying and diffusing in the light. There was a dead silence, and time passed unknowingly. The turbid oil lamp gradually became bright and clear. The old man slowly withdrew his palms and quietly looked at Ning Kai, whose face was calm and eyes did not show any expectation, but in fact, his hands were slightly trembling. The old man sighed softly. There is breath in heaven and earth, and that breath is the so-called primordial qi. Cultivators can perceive the existence of primordial qi by their psyche. Therefore, whether you can step into the state of cultivation first depends on whether your psyche can accumulate and manifest. When I was in the city of Wei, I went to see you and confirmed that there was no fluctuation of breath in your body. Today, I carefully examined your body and found that it was indeed so. Your snow mountain and ocean of qi are as empty as a field. There is nothing. Chapter 21. Hearing this conclusion, Ning Kai was silent for a long time. Then he raised his head and looked at the old man. He raised his right index finger and pointed it at his temple, as if he was about to commit suicide with a crossbow. He asked seriously, "Doesn't psyche power or consciousness come from the brain?" The old man, Liu Qingchen, looked at him gently and said slowly, "This is not wrong. But although psyche power originates from the head, how can it communicate with the breath of heaven and earth outside the body? The so-called cultivation is to put your psyche into the snow mountain in front of your chest and the ocean of qi behind your waist. There are 17 qi acupoints around the snow mountain and the ocean of qi, just like the thousands of caves at the bottom of Zhongli Mountain. The caves are facing the wind and water, making a wonderful song. Only in this way can the heaven and earth understand our thoughts and respond to each other. The opening or closing of the viscera and qi acupoints are formed in the womb. No matter how hard you cultivate, you can't change it. So there is a saying that cultivation is just a gift from Haotian. I saw that 11 of the 17 acupoints around the snow mountain and the ocean of qi are blocked. So no matter how you cultivate your psyche power, you can't contact the heaven and earth. But you don't have to be sad and disappointed. Among the millions of people in the world, it is rare to see someone with 13 qi acupoints opened. It's normal to have a body like yours, the old man comforted him slowly. Ning Kai lowered his head and smiled bitterly. In the city of Wei, he had comforted himself many times, saying that only the really abnormal geniuses could cultivate. Now it seemed that it was true. According to this standard, those geniuses who had 15 or 16 chi acupoints opened were really favored by the heaven. It was like walking on the road and suddenly being hit by a pie from the heaven. Why didn't I win the super gift? He sighed in his heart and expressed his sincere gratitude to the old man. Then he got off the carriage with Sang Sang. The light of the oil lamp in the carriage was dim. After a long time, the curtain was lifted again. Li Yu, the fourth princess of Tang, sat in front of the old man and slightly leaned forward. She asked, "Is there no possibility at all?" Liu Qingchen admired Ning Ke very much. However, as a psyche master who had already entered the see-through state, he did not hesitate to use his psyche power to check and sort out Ning Ke's body. For example, Her Highness had ordered him to do so. People with strong willpower and pure temperament can often obtain extremely strong psyche power through meditation. Ning Ke is undoubtedly such a person. That's why I had some expectations for him. I thought that perhaps he had only opened 10 of his 17 apertures and was on the verge of enlightenment. However, because he couldn't cultivate in Border City, he couldn't trigger his thoughts to enter the initial state. It's a pity that there are 11 chi openings in his body that are blocked. Hao Tian doesn't care about him, so it's useless no matter how good his potential is. The old man's face was full of regret. In his opinion, if Ning Ke could really cultivate, even if he only had 10 acupores cleared, his future would be limitless, given his temperament and good handwriting. It was a pity that the fate of this lad was not so good. Since that's the case, there's no need to waste any more energy. Li Yu looked a little tired after days of running around. She lowered her head and pondered for a moment. Then she said calmly, "I really shouldn't trouble you for this matter." Liu Qingchen raised his white eyebrows slowly and looked at the princess's face quietly. He knew that his previous words had determined Ning Ke's future. After confirming that Ning Ke could not cultivate, she directly gave up the idea of cultivating him. After a moment of silence, the old man persuaded, "There are many masters in Chang'an. A young man like Ning Ke may not seem special, but I believe that if this lad grows up for a few more years, he will definitely become the best soldier in the Tang Empire." Li Yu didn't expect the old man to have such a high evaluation of Ning Quebec. She frowned slightly and explained slowly, "That lad's martial arts skills and temperament are excellent. If he was still in the city of Wei or in the army, I would definitely make him work for me at all costs. But now he is going to enter the academy and walk on the road of literature. When he is able to influence the imperial court, he will be old and so will I. What's the point then?" The old man was silent for a long time and suddenly said, "Although only 6 of the 17 acupores in his body have been cleared and it's impossible for him to enter the cultivation state according to common sense, but Hao Tian rotates and nothing is set in stone. After all, my state is too low, but he has a chance to enter the academy. The academy is a wonderful and holy place, another world. In the future, if he can really enter the second floor of the academy, who knows what wonderful things will happen to him. Maybe he can really embark on the path of cultivation." The second floor. Li Yu shook her head and said, "How many people in this world can enter the second floor of the academy? Although Ning Ke is a good lad, you have too much confidence in him." Liu Qingchen looked at her and said with a smile, "When you said that he was going to enter the academy and walk on the road of literature, you didn't seem to think that this lad could not enter the academy. You should know that the difficulty of the academy entrance examination is also very high. From this, I can see that you have full confidence in him. So who can be sure that this little soldier from the border town cannot enter the second floor one day?" Li Yu was slightly stunned and did not know how to answer the old man's rhetorical question. Now that she thought about it carefully, it seemed that she really did not think that Ning Ke would not be able to enter the academy, which was the most difficult to enter in the world. So where did her confidence in him come from? Was it because of the stories she heard beside the fire, or the calm expression of the lad when he jumped over the wall of fire? She subconsciously looked out of the window and kept silent as she watched the back of the master and the servant who walked past the fire. Ning Kai knew that his temperament and willpower were suitable for cultivation, but he could not. In fact, he was used to this kind of treatment after being amazed at first and then regretted. He had experienced it 7 years ago when he met Darky at the eastern foot of Min Mountain in the Yen territory, and 2 years ago when he made military achievements in the city of Wei and was checked by the military ministry for potential. If he could enter the state of cultivation, with his military achievements in the city of Wei, he might have already become the focus of the Tang Empire's military. Then he would not have to kill the horse gang to accumulate military achievements and then enter the academy. Because he was mentally prepared, he was not very disappointed when he heard the bad news. But after all, Liu Qingchen was a master that he had the closest contact with, so he always had some hope. Unfortunately, hope was like the peach blossoms in the watercolor painting, always hidden in the corner of the garden, all unreal. Just when he was ready to pull himself together and give up the illusion to practice his swordsmanship all the way to Chang and to seek worldly happiness, he did not expect that the old man Liu Qingchen would invite him to board the carriage the next night. This time, Sang Sang did not go with him. Perhaps the princess missed the feeling of chatting with the maidservants on the spring journey, or the little prince of the barbarian tribe missed Sang Sang. Anyway, Sang Sang was summoned to the princess carriage. I believe that you have memorized the article on the response of the Tao by heart. But it seems that my judgment is not wrong since you could not sense the existence of the breath of nature after so many years. Liu Qingchen smiled and said to him. Ning Kai scratched his head and said with a bitter smile, "Old sir, I guess you did not ask me to come here today to give me another blow. After you return to Chang'an, you will enter the academy. As I am old, I may stay in the princess mansion to recuperate, so it will not be easy to see you again. So I want to talk to you." Liu Qingchen looked at him kindly and said, "I know that people are curious about cultivation. Although you cannot enter this path, there may be something you want to know." "I have a lot." Ning Kai answered honestly. Chapter 22. Liu Qingchen smiled and asked, "What do you want to know?" Ning Kai thought about it for a long time and said, "I want to know, what is cultivation?" Liu Qingchen smiled and said, "You are really greedy." Ning Kai said without any embarrassment, "Then, can you tell me how many states there are in cultivation and what are the different abilities in different states? It's still a choice beyond my expectation." Liu Qingchen smiled and said, "You know, although ordinary people don't know about these things, it is not a secret after all. Not a secret is still a secret." Ning Kai answered with a smile, "I will keep it for you." "All right." Liu Qingchen laughed and asked after a short pause, "Do you know Haotian Taoism?" Ning Kai looked at this South School wayfarer of Haotian Taoism and nodded. "I was born in the South School of Haotian Taoism and was ordered to travel around the world. People often call us wayfarer of school. So since you want to know something about cultivation, I will start from Haotian Taoism. Haotian Taoism worships Haotian and is the only orthodox cultivation in the world. Because Haotian shines on the world, everything in the world can breathe with it. This breath is the breath of nature or primordial qi I talked about last night. So Haotian is the beginning of everything. Humans are originally one of the myriad of beings. Living in ignorance in this journey of heaven and earth, Haotian gave us a revelation, and we began to understand the principles of nature and creation. Therefore, we use our minds to control the qi of heaven and earth and do all kinds of mysterious things. This is cultivation. The road of cultivation is long and arduous. It is a test of willpower. This road is divided into 5 stages, which are the 5 states you mentioned. The initial state is called the initial awareness state. It means that the cultivator's psyche is released from the ocean of qi and mountain of snow and understands the existence of the breath of nature. The second state is called the perception state. In this state, the cultivator can touch the primordial qi floating in the world and live in harmony with it. He can even communicate with it. The third state is called the no-doubt state. It means that the cultivator can understand the rules of the primordial chi flowing in the world and make use of it. The so-called sword master and talisman master refer to this state. The fourth state is called the see-through state. Cultivators who enter this realm are able to merge their consciousness with the primal energies of the universe. For a psychic, this means that they can use their consciousness to attack their enemies. If they stay in this realm for a long time, they may be able to make some special moves. Young man, you don't have to look at me like this. I did enter the see-through realm. Unfortunately, I barely managed to step my right foot into the see-through realm when I was old. Now I'm running out of oil and my lamp is about to run out. I probably don't have any hope to drag my other foot into the see-through realm in this life. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been so troublesome to kill a great sword master that night. The light from the oil lamp in the carriage was dim, as if the carriage was really short of oil. Liu Qingchen said with a smile, and then looked down at his left foot, sighing that time never waits for him. The fifth state is called knowing destiny. The so-called knowing destiny means knowing your destiny. Cultivators who enter this realm do not just understand the laws of the primal energies of the universe on the surface, but grasp the laws of the primal energies of the universe in essence. They understand the connection between Hao Tian and all things in nature, and understand the origin of the world. Only those who enter this state can be regarded as the real Tao. Ning Ke listened to these things with great interest. When he found that the old man had finished, he quickly raised his hand and asked, "Sir, is there a higher state above the 5 states? Why do you think so?" Liu Qingchen looked at him with interest. He answered, "If cultivation is really a long road, then there must be no end to this road. In fact, there is no road in this world that can't be walked, so I think there must be a higher state. Young man, you can't even enter the initial state. I didn't expect that you didn't get depressed, but became more interested." Hearing the old man's scolding, Ning Ke smiled even more innocently and said, "Let's just say that I'm studious. I've never seen a man who is as studious as he is lecherous." Liu Qingchen smiled and said. Ning Ke praised him in his heart, and then spread out his hands and corrected, "Then it's not studious, it's curiosity." Liu Qingchen pondered for a long time, and then raised his head to look at him and said slowly, "It's said that there are many mysterious states above the knowing destiny state, but there are only 2 in the classics. One is Tianqi, and the other is limitless." The so-called Tianqi means that a cultivator can directly listen to the revelation of Haotian, worship the divine skill of Haotian Taoism, and temporarily borrow the power and light of Haotian in the realm of emptiness. Haotian shines on the world. Even if it's just a wisp of power and light, it can be imagined how powerful the state is. Ning Ke thought of a great divine power in the world, with his white robe fluttering in the wind, and a light beam falling from the clouds. With a wave of his hand, the clouds rolled and the mountains shook. He couldn't help but be shaken, and his voice became slightly hoarse. "Limitless, what kind of state is it?" The classics only recorded that such a state had once appeared in the world, but there was no specific description. There was only a brief description: follow the heart's desire to be limitless. Liu Qingchen frowned slightly, but his face was calm and peaceful. He said slowly, "According to my guess, in the so-called limitless state, the sage's psyche can reach thousands of miles away. How magnificent it is! Follow the heart's desire to be limitless." Ning Ke was deeply moved by these 7 words. But was it limitless or limitless? Vaguely, he seemed to capture some kind of bold temperament hidden in these 2 words, which was not as leisurely as the old man, but just extremely free and unrestrained. As for the limitless, maybe the Academy has more records about it. Liu Qingchen looked at the young lad's dazed face, and said with emotion, "Grand cultivators who can enter these 2 states must be sages. Although there is an old saying that a sage will appear every 1,000 years, it has been many years since a sage appeared in the world. So these are just myths and legends. Don't think too much about it." Ning Ke bowed again to show that he was enlightened. The old man smiled and said, I thought you would ask about the famous grand cultivators and unworldly sublime beings in the world. It seems that young men should be more interested in these things, but I didn't expect you to ask about these. Ning Ke put his hands on his knees, and after a long silence, he looked up at the old man and answered seriously, knowing about the strongest people in the world means nothing to me now. They are eagles flying high in the sky, and I am just an ant crawling on the ground. They don't care about me, so I don't need to care about them either. Then, why do you ask about these cultivation basics? The old man looked at him with a strange expression. Ning Ke answered seriously, those grand cultivators will not appear in my life in a short period of time. However, when I enter Chang'an, it is very likely that I will meet some relatively ordinary cultivators, such as the great sword master like the scholar in the green robe. I can't cultivate myself, so I have to figure out what cultivation is and how they fight. What is your purpose? The old man's flowery eyebrows slowly raised, as if he was very interested in his answer. Ning Ke lowered his head and smiled. Then he raised his head and answered calmly, if I am forced to fight with cultivators in the future, what you have taught me today will be very helpful for me to defeat them. An ordinary person fighting with a cultivator who can mobilize the chi of heaven and earth? And you want to defeat them? The old man stared at Ning Ke's eyes and murmured repeatedly. Suddenly, his eyebrows trembled, and a burst of extremely joyful laughter burst out from his skinny body, ha 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 ha. The laughter gradually stopped. The old man looked at Ning Ke, who was gradually embarrassed, and said with a smile, very bold, I like it. Chapter 23. It was late at night. Ning Ke got off the horse carriage. Liu Qingchen lifted the curtain and looked at the back of the lad. Listening to the faint music coming from the frontier fortress in the field, he smiled. As a cultivator who had stepped into the see-through state, even if he only had 1 foot over the high threshold, it was enough for him to be highly respected in any country and any city, and he did not need to deal with ordinary people at all. A psyche master needed more time to meditate and cultivate psyche, so Liu Qingchen's time was really like gold. But he was still willing to spend 1 or 2 nights or even more time chatting with Ning Ke, talking about seemingly trivial things, because he really liked Ning Quebec. He liked the calmness and self-improvement hidden under the young boy's gentle and tender appearance, as well as the heroic spirit that occasionally burst out like the previous moment. Heroic, magnificent, self-improvement and calmness were the most appreciated qualities of the Tang people, and the elder Liu Qingchen was a native of Tang. What he told Ning Ke tonight were all the introductory lessons of the South School of Haotian Taoism. Although it was not a secret and according to the sect rules, ordinary people should not know, he still said it, because he believed in one thing, I always feel that you will become a great cultivator in the future. He knew that Ning Ke's chi aperture was blocked and it was impossible for him to cultivate. However, the old man had no reason to believe that Ning Ke could embark on the difficult path he was currently walking on. He also hoped that Ning Ke could walk more steadily and further than him. The old man looked at the fading and blurred back of the lad outside the window, and murmured to himself, I only start to be presumptuous and blindly follow my intuition when I am about to die. Maybe, this is the enlightenment of Haotian to me. When they returned to the shabby tent, Sang Sang had already returned. Ning Ke asked what the princess wanted her to do, and as expected, he got a vague answer. He had long been accustomed to his little handmaiden's laziness in using her brain, so he jokingly scolded her and drank a few cups of wine. Then the two of them washed up hastily and went to bed. The next day, under the protection of hundreds of cavalrymen, the caravan continued southward towards Chang'an. Ning Ke and his servants' days were no longer as boring as before. Before nightfall, Liu Qingchen would ask Ning Ke to sit in his carriage and chat with him. Her Royal Highness also often asked Sang Sang to accompany her. Fortunately, Peng Guotao had sent a bodyguard to drive the simple carriage, otherwise Ning Ke would have been forced to play without a driver. As they chatted in the carriage, Ning Ke learned more about cultivation, such as the various ways that cultivators use their psyche to control the chi of heaven and earth, and how cultivators could strengthen their connection with heaven and earth through some special items. He also learned how sword masters used their psyche to compress the primordial chi into invisible ropes and then tie up the thin and sharp hiltless flying sword. There were no strict standards for special items to strengthen the connection between cultivators and heaven and earth. Hautian Taoism often used wooden horsetail whisk sword, Buddhism often used prayer beads and wooden fish, and as for Fu paper flying swords, they were very common standard equipment. It was relatively rare that some grand cultivators would use strange items such as brush, ink, and magic staffs. Using psyche power to seal the chi of heaven and earth into the Fu paper is a talisman master, sealing the chi of heaven and earth into the tactical array is a tactical array master, condensing the chi of heaven and earth into the sword is a sword master, using psyche power to directly mobilize the chi of heaven and earth is a psyche master, and so on. Liu Qingchen held a cup of green tea and leaned against the window as he spoke leisurely. Hey, are you kidding me? What kind of master is he if he seals the chi of heaven and earth in the toilet bowl? Horse master or barrel master? After chatting for a long time, the old and the young naturally became familiar with each other. Ning Ke gradually showed his indolent and rude side. He bit a brush dipped in ink and waved his right arm to express his strong doubts. The old man put down the teacup, stared at the lad and scolded, "Do you know what a convention is? It has been called for thousands of years, what's the problem? Common achievements should be easy to remember, don't make those sour words." All right. Ning Ke failed miserably in the face of the thickness of time represented by thousands of years. He hung his wrist in the shaking carriage and calmed himself down. The thick black tip of the brush moved quickly and slowly on the snow-like rice paper, making notes. As for the fighting methods of cultivators, sword masters use swordsmanship, talisman masters use talisman techniques, and psyche masters like me, of course, use psyche skills. Grand cultivators who have entered the knowing destiny state can hardly be specifically distinguished. I once heard that some elders in the previous generation practiced divine skills, but I don't know the details. These names are not impressive enough. Ning Ke's expression was a little stiff. He bit the tail of the brush and looked at the old man, saying vaguely, "I feel that they can be called magicians, and what they use is called magic." The old man's white eyebrows were tightly knitted, and he looked at him sternly and said, "The problem is, how do you explain the word magic?" Ning Ke was defeated again and spread out his hands to show his innocence. In addition to the various kinds of cultivators mentioned above, in fact, the most common cultivators in the world are warriors. They are not as sensitive to the chi of heaven and earth as other sects, but they are also extremely powerful in terms of fighting power. When warriors fight, they can cover their bodies with the chi of heaven and earth, just like wearing a layer of heavy armor from head to toe. When they cultivate, they will mobilize the chi of heaven and earth to stimulate their skin and flesh, so that they can be tempered with iron bones. The giant man with a yellowish luster at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road is a warrior. Yes, but that person's state is not too high. The 4 generals of the Tang Empire are all top warriors in the world. Even if the arrowhead can pierce their armor, it can't pierce their protective primordial chi. Even if the arrowhead can penetrate the protective primordial chi, it can't cause any damage to their iron-like bodies. In the face of such a powerhouse, no matter how good your archery is, it's useless. Hearing this, Ning Ke naturally thought of the name Xia Ho. He lowered his head and transcribed the notes calmly, while he kept thinking about how to deal with such a powerhouse. If you choose to close the distance and fight with these powerhouses, it's even more suicidal. Although your strength is good, compared with them, you are like a vole and a lion. You can't shake them even if you use all your strength, but they can easily break your neck with just a little clench of their fingers. Ning Ke suddenly looked up and asked seriously, "If I attach the primordial chi to the arrow, what about the lethality to the warrior?" The old man thought for a moment and slowly shook his head. Very few cultivators try to attach the chi of heaven and earth to the arrow, because the arrow is different from the flying sword. In order to ensure the speed, it must be very light. Therefore, it is easy to be disturbed by the natural senses, and can't carve talismans on it. The attached primordial chi will dissipate too fast. Of course, if someone can solve the problem of the dissipation of primordial chi, this kind of arrow will undoubtedly be a terrible long-range attack. Ning Ke was thoughtful. Chapter 24. It is said that there are as many warriors as dogs in Chang'an and sword masters are everywhere. But this is an exaggeration. But it is the capital of the empire, the most magnificent place in the world. There are many hidden talents and cultivators. If you go to Chang'an, you will be fine in the academy. But you should be careful when you are outside the academy. Yes. Ning Ke answered and then asked tentatively, Mr. Liu, is there anyone in Chang'an that I need to be wary of, or should I say, someone powerful that I can't afford to offend? Liu Qingchen looked at the lad and sneered, who said that he didn't want to know this that night. Ning Ke smiled and scratched his head. It's meaningless to talk about this. Liu Qingchen shook his head with a smile and said, you just need to remember that there are many schools of cultivation in the world. Buddhism, Taoism, Diabolism and the Academy are the three sections. Buddhism lives in remote places and Taoism sets up altars everywhere. Don't mention the Devil's Doctrine. Taoism is the Haotian Taoism school I belong to. There are many powerful cultivators and they are respected and worshipped by the royal families of various countries. If you have heard of the West Hill Divine Kingdom, you should know that it is the headquarters of Haotian Taoism. Respected and worshipped by the royal families of various countries. Does the empire treat Haotian Taoism the same way? Ning Ke frowned and asked. Liu Qingchen smiled bitterly. As the most powerful country in the world, the Tang Empire was the only secular royal family that dared to disrespect Haotian Taoism. Haotian Taoism could do nothing to the empire. But he was a Tang citizen, but in Haotian Taoism, he was in an awkward situation. What about the Devil's Doctrine? Are there any powerful cultivators in the Devil's Doctrine? Ning Ke noticed the strange look on the old man's face, so he quickly changed the topic and said with a smile, speaking of which, you said that the great sword master used the methods of the Devil's Doctrine at the entrance of the Northern Mountain Road. I really don't understand what is the method of the Devil's Doctrine. Hearing the words, Devil's Doctrine, Liu Qingchen became serious and said, don't remember this part and don't tell anyone else. Yes, sir. Whether it is Taoism, Buddhism or the Academy, these decent cultivators all use people to perceive the chi of heaven and earth and live in harmony with each other. More precisely, they can use the chi of heaven and earth. Liu Qingchen squinted his eyes, as if he was recalling something. He said slowly, the Devil's Doctrine is different from the other sections. They absorb the chi of heaven and earth into their bodies by force. Is there something wrong? No matter how Ning Ke thought about it, he did not find anything wrong with this cultivation method. It seemed to be more direct to understand it literally. Don't say such nonsense in the future. If you were in the Academy or Haotian Taoism, if you dared to make such comments about the Devil's Doctrine, you would be expelled from the sect or severely punished. Liu Qingchen warned sternly, compared to the nature, the human body is like an ant. The ocean of chi and mountain of snow in the body can barely contain the psyche power. How can the human body withstand the forceful absorption of the chi of heaven and earth? There's only one ending, that is, exploding and dying like the great sword master at the entrance of the Northern Mountain Road. But since the Devil's Doctrine is called a sect, Ning Ke paid attention to his tone and asked respectfully, I think there are many cultivators in the world. If absorbing the chi of heaven and earth will cause their bodies to explode, how can they inherit? The Devil's Doctrine has a set of evil methods to help them transform their bodies so that they can absorb a little bit of the chi of heaven and earth. However, the process is extremely bloody and cruel. According to the seniors, only 2 or 3 of the 100 cultivators in the Devil's Doctrine can survive the initial pain of body explosion. It's indeed cruel. Ning Ke said with a frown, but he was thinking that there were very few people in the world who had the potential to cultivate. The Devil's Doctrine's method would only consume a lot of the cultivators. Maybe it was also the reason why the Orthodox Buddhism did not allow the existence of the Devil's Doctrine. Liu Qingchen guessed what the lad was thinking. He said in a more serious tone, if the Devil's Doctrine forcibly transforms their bodies, how can they be regarded as normal people? Man is one person in the world, and there is another world beyond man. To absorb the qi of heaven and earth into the body, the Devil's Doctrine wants to transform themselves into a world. As for the world, there is only Haotian. So what the Devil's Doctrine thinks and cultivates is really a great evil. One night when they were approaching Chang'an, Ning Ke once again came to the side of the old man's horse carriage. But this time, he came uninvited. The stars in the night sky shone on the campsite, making his figure look especially lofty. The oil lamp in the carriage was still lit. Liu Qingchen was reading the notes that Ning Ke had written these days. Looking at the small regular script on the white paper and the delicate and beautiful handwriting, he could not understand how the lad could write such beautiful handwriting on the bumpy horse carriage. He could not help but be full of admiration. Suddenly he frowned and slowly put down the paper in his hand. He looked at the curtain and said, "Come in." Ning Ke walked out of the carriage and sat on the seat he had in the day with his hands on his knees. After a moment of silence, he said, "Mr. Liu, there's something I don't understand. Since I don't have the potential to cultivate, why do you still teach me so much?" The lad raised his head and his eyes were unusually bright. He asked in a trembling voice, "Is it because you can see that I'm gifted? That's why you treat me differently?" Liu Qingchen looked at him in surprise. After a moment, he hesitantly asked, "What's your gift?" So it was Ning Ke's turn to be surprised. He looked at the old man with his mouth open and asked awkwardly, "If I knew what gift I have, why would I ask you?" The old man pointed at his nose with a trembling finger. He really did not know what to say at this moment. "Mr. Liu, actually I'm a man with many secrets." It seemed that Ning Ke had not given up on convincing a see-through sublime being to believe that he was a gifted male protagonist. He rubbed his face nervously and said, after coming to this city of Wei, others think that I'm very lazy and sleepy all the time, even when I'm sitting in the horse carriage. But that's not the case. I'm actually meditating when I'm sleepy. You don't have to look like that. It's true. You know that there's no entertainment in the border town. I like to write every day because I'm good at it and I feel happy when I write. Other than that, I spend all my time reading the article on the response of the Tao. You should also know that the article on the response of the Tao is really boring. That's why I often fall asleep while reading. But now that I think about it, I don't think it's real sleep. Ning Ke looked at the old man and said very sincerely, "Because when I just fell asleep, I often felt that the buildings, people, and everything else around me were far away from me. The whole world became a world with me and you in me. I could even vaguely feel some kind of breathing in a mysterious rhythm." Liu Qingchen's expression gradually became serious. Although it was rare to meditate in one's sleep, it was not completely unknown in the classics of Haotian Taoism. Chapter 25. Ning Ke recalled the feeling in the dream seriously and said, "In my dream, those continuous but rhythmic breaths finally became something substantial. They gathered together and enveloped my body. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold those things that were lighter than water. I could only watch them slip through my fingers." Liu Qingchen suppressed his excitement and asked in a low voice, "How big was the range you felt in the dream?" "No, I should say, what was it like? A basin of water? A stream? Or a small pond?" Ning Ke raised his head and answered blankly, "It was like a sea." Liu Qingchen's body stiffened slightly and then he fell back to the soft cushion. After a long silence, he laughed at himself with a tired smile and murmured, "Yes, how could it be?" Ning Ke had guessed from his expression that things were not as he had imagined, but he still asked, "Mr. Liu, is this the initial state you mentioned? Is what I felt the breath of heaven and earth?" Liu Qingchen patted his shoulder to comfort him and said bitterly, "The initial state is the initial awareness state. I told you a few days ago that the cultivator's psyche is released from the ocean of qi and mountain of snow and begins to understand the existence of the breath of heaven and earth. In other words, this is the first moment when a secular person opens his eyes and sees a whole new world. The first world he sees determines the future of this cultivator. Because what he sees and what he feels is the projection of the primal energies of all things in the world on his mind. And the purer, the stronger, and more compact this cultivator's meditation will be, the greater the range of the primal energies he can feel." The old man looked at Ning Ke quietly and said, "Cultivators with poor aptitudes can only feel the qi of heaven and earth in the initial awareness state, and the projection in their soul is just a basin of water. Cultivators with better aptitudes can feel the qi of heaven and earth in a wider range, and the projection is just a small pond. If he can feel a stream or even a lake, then he will become a respected grand cultivator in the future." Ning Ke frowned and wanted to say something, but was stopped by the old man. The old man continued, "There are very few people who have reached the peak of the knowing destiny state. Among them, Lu Bai, the sage of sword from the South Jin kingdom is the most talented. He entered the initial state when he was less than 6 years old. As soon as he entered the initial state, he saw an endless yellow river. This was a true genius. This is why he was able to dominate the south with his yellow river sword will, and is now regarded by all the cultivators in the world as the person most likely to break through the 5 states. If seeing a yellow river was the most powerful cultivator in the world, then what about seeing an ocean?" Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Although he had many secrets, he had never thought of himself as a genius, not to mention a genius who was more abnormal than the universally recognized geniuses. However, he was still a little unwilling. Maybe this sounds a little arrogant, a little unreasonable, or narcissistic. He chose his words carefully, lowered his head and said slowly, "Is it possible that I'm really stronger than the sword sage of South Jin Kingdom? It's just because I've been meditating for so many years that I can feel a wider range when I entered the initial awareness state. What's wider than a raging river? I don't know, but I'm sure it's not the boundless ocean, because they are two completely different concepts." Liu Qingchen looked at Ning Ke, who was lowering his head, and sighed softly. He said, "Kid, do you know what the ocean represents when you enter the initial awareness state? It represents the qi of heaven and earth of the whole world. No one can see everything in that new world the moment they open their eyes. That's because it's impossible. Even the legendary saints can't do it." He patted the young lad's slightly stiff shoulder again, and comforted him with a smile, "Although it's just a dream, it's not a bad dream." Ning Ke left in silence. He had always been indifferent to cultivation. If it weren't for Liu Qingchen's advice these days, which made him have some unnecessary thoughts, his mood would probably be much better now. As the saying goes, if there was no hope, there would naturally be no disappointment. If there was despair at the beginning, then there would be no hope at the beginning at all. The little handmaiden Sang Sang brought the basin of hot water in front of him, deftly wrung the towel, and then covered his tired face with the slightly hot and steaming towel. She asked curiously, "Young master, what did you ask tonight?" Ning Ke's voice came out from under the hot towel, as if it had been moistened by the steaming water. It hummed in a low voice, "I went to tell old Liu that I have a little secret that I won't tell you. But since I told you, should you tell me that you have already seen through my little secret, and then bow down to me, a talented cultivation genius?" Sang Sang kept repeating these words in her mind, and then she felt a little dizzy, and hurriedly rubbed her eyebrows. She pulled off the towel from Ning Ke's face and rubbed it twice in the water. Then she twisted her waist and splashed the water out of the carriage. She said, "Young master, it seems that you have become more of an idiot this time. Indeed, he looked like an idiot. Ning Kai turned around and looked at the stars above the field through the window. His palm subconsciously touched his cheeks to touch those tiny freckles that could not be touched at all. He murmured in a low voice, "So what if I can play with the flying sword? I can play with the Shenyuan sword, but can you guys?" Sang Sang could not help but shake her head when she heard that he was talking nonsense that she did not understand. Ning Kai sat up and took out the worn-out article on the response of the Tao. He did not open it, but silently stared at the cover for a long time, as if he was trying to find out what secrets were hidden in it. "Bring the basin over." His voice was much calmer now. He lit the match and moved it to a corner of the book. After a while, the old yellow book began to burn. He gently loosened his fingers, letting the article on the response of the Tao, which had accompanied him for many years, fall into the brass basin and burn faster and faster. Sang Sang looked at this scene in surprise. Ning Kai watched as the pages of the book curled and turned black in the flames, and then suddenly burst into flames and finally turned into layers of ashes. He tightened his right hand on the window and felt a little empty in his heart. It was as if a friend who had accompanied him for many years had gone far away and would never come back. It was also as if the dream of his youth had disappeared like a bubble. "Am I very useless?" he asked. Sang Sang shook her head. Ning Kai smiled and said, "No one is better at archery than me, and no one is fiercer than me with a knife. People of my age have not killed as many people as I have. I'm not useless. I'm a woodcutter of Shubi Lake. It's just that I can't do acrobatics with flying swords. If there's a chance in the future, I'll kill some King Grand cultivators like how I killed the horse gang." Sang Sang tightened her lips and nodded with a smile. This was not self-comfort after giving up, but Ning Kai's firm recognition. Those brave bodyguards at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road had almost defeated a great sword master, so why couldn't he? There was no truly invincible person in this world. Those unworldly sublime beings were still human beings, so he could defeat them. In this world, there were many people who found that they were actually very weak and could not fulfill their dreams. They would feel lost, miserable, inferior, or even autistic. Then many people would immerse themselves in this kind of pain or the illusion of success. They would lock themselves in the cage of their hearts and keep struggling, hoping to return to the past. When they found that they could not write the new dream in the brothel, one of the 4 great masterpieces that could be hidden in the deep mountains and passed down for thousands of years, they locked themselves in the village for 30 years, drinking porridge every day and using their left hand as a red sleeve. Did they think that they were Chao Shuachin? Ning Kai had never been such a person. If he could not be Chao Shuachin, he would be Jin Yong. If he could not be an emperor, he would be a calligrapher. If he could not be a general, he would be a grand secretary. If he could not be a cultivator, so what? Those who walked on the road to the end were not wrong. Although the people around them would suffer, they might even succeed in the end. However, those who had the determination to choose a new road immediately might be more worthy of respect. Life was a good guy. It took more courage to ask him to turn back than to ask him to keep walking. Chapter 26. Ning Kai was in a bad mood after being tossed between hope and disappointment for the past few days. But he quickly stopped thinking about it. No matter if he was happy or unhappy, it was a good time to drink and get drunk. Song Song's illness happened again that night, and her little feet were as cold as ice branches. So the master and handmaiden opened a jar of strong liquor and drank to their heart's content. The little handmaiden drank most of the jar of strong liquor, but Ning Kai was the first one to fall. Sang Sang moved him to the cushion with difficulty, and then lifted the quilt to cover him. She also got in and habitually put her little feet into his arms. Ning Kai had a dream accompanied by the pervading fragrance of the liquor. In the dream, he felt the warm sea beside him again, but this time he didn't reach out to catch it like before, only to find that he could only catch nothing. It should be Liu Qingchen's words that worked. This time he was very clear that he was dreaming, so he stood in the warm sea, like a stranger or a bystander calmly watching everything in front of him. He smiled in the dream and thought of a sentence, "Everything is an illusion, it can't scare me." Maybe because of the unprecedented calmness, Ning Kai could clearly see the appearance of the sea in the dream this time. The boundless sea that occupied the whole space was not blue, but green. The color was very deep and very transparent, like a crystal-clear jade. He stood on the green sea, and didn't bend down to catch the slowly flowing green. Instead, he looked at it quietly, guessing where it would flow next and what kind of shape it would change into. 2 white flowers suddenly appeared in the green sea. The petals were snow white, without a trace of other colors, and without the common color of those common flowers, it was just a monotonous and boring white. The seawater slapped against the roots of the white flowers. If they had roots, under the nourishment of the green seawater, the 2 white flowers grew rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. The petals fell off one by one, and fell on the sea and became new white flowers. In this way, the white flowers quickly spread and occupied the whole sea in his sight, extending to the sky. Ning Kai looked at such a beautiful scene, and his mind was shaken. He stepped on the flowers and walked to the sky, stepping on the petals. His bare feet touched the delicate petals of the white flowers, bouncing up and down, feeling the softness and tenderness, very wonderful. In the carriage beside the field, Ning Kai was lying on his side on the cushion. Most of the mattress on his body had already been lifted. His forehead was full of sweat and he was holding a pair of small feet tightly in his arms. The skin on the little handmaiden's feet was much better than the rest of her body. It was as white as snow and looked like 2 small white flowers. He furrowed his brows and curled his lips from time to time. No one knew what he was thinking in his dream. His feet subconsciously kicked the mattress, and he didn't know where he touched, but he felt very comfortable. A satisfied expression appeared on his face, and he stopped moving. His mind gradually blurred and Ning Kai had long forgotten that he was in a dream. His mind was shaky but unusually calm as he walked on the surface of the sea and among the white flowers. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat and his whole body slowly floated away from the petals and quickly flew to the sky above the sea. When he reached a very high altitude, he looked down and saw that the white flowers on the green sea had long disappeared. He could faintly see a layer of red surface in the depths of the sea, extending in all directions. He broke through the seawater and dived into the depths of the green sea. After diving for a long time, he finally saw the layer of red. It was a layer of viscous deep red slurry. It was boundlessly red and looked like tomato sauce, but more like blood that was about to solidify. The blood suddenly broke the silence and became boiling. Inside, there were countless people without facial features slowly stood up and then fell down. They stood up again and fell down again. They struggled and silently cried in pain. But no matter how they struggled and cried, the thin film on their facial features always imprisoned them in the eternal silent world of blood. The deepest fear in his life slowly and unstoppably occupied Ning Kai's body, turning him into a stone statue. Just like that, he stood beside the red blood sea in ignorance, watching the silent cruel scenes with his own eyes. The blood sea turned into land, and then there was also a sky. Ning Kai stood between the sky and the ground and found himself in the wilderness. There were countless corpses under his feet and in the distance. Those corpses were the cavalry of the Tang Empire, the warriors of the Yueluan Kingdom, the crossbowmen of the South Jin Kingdom, and many elite cavalries of the grassland barbarians. Countless amounts of blood flowed from the bodies of these soldiers and dyed the entire wilderness red. 3 black smoke stably floated in front of the wilderness, looking in this direction indifferently as if they were alive. It's getting dark. I've said that it's getting dark, but no one has ever believed me. Someone said in a disdainful tone beside Ning Kai's ear. Ning Kai suddenly turned around. He did not see who had spoken, but he saw many people looking up at the sky. Among them were the confused peddlers, the unwilling officials, the timid young ladies, and the crazy laughing monks. No matter how different their clothes and expressions were, they all had one thing in common, which was that they all raised their heads high like fat geese waiting to be fed. Countless people in the wilderness looked up at the sky in horror. Ning Ke subconsciously followed their gaze and found that it was still daytime because of the scorching sun hanging in the sky. But for some reason, the temperature in the wilderness was very low, and the rays of the sun were very dim. The world was dark, as if night was coming. A patch of darkness spread from the horizon. There was nothing special about it, just absolute darkness, just like the white flowers he saw at the beginning of the dream. There were no other colors. This was the darkness in the deepest part of human dreams. The people looking up at the sky were very afraid. Ning Ke was very afraid, but they did not know why they were afraid. Ning Ke looked around for the person who had spoken to him. He wanted to ask that person what had happened and why the sky had turned dark. But no matter how he looked, he could not find that person. He could only vaguely see a very tall figure passing through the crowd and walking out of the wilderness. He shouted at the back of the tall figure, "Hey! Is that you? What's going on?" The tall man did not turn around. His back was extremely bleak as he left the crowd until he disappeared. However, Ning Ke's shout startled the people in the wilderness who were looking up at the sky. Someone complained, "It's getting dark. Why don't you watch carefully and disturb our last moments of peace?" What a disgusting little thing. Only a few people complained. Most of the people in the wilderness withdrew their gazes from the sky and looked at Ning Ke in surprise. The expressions in their eyes changed strangely. Some became more and more shocked, some became more and more passionate, and some even slowly shed tears. A drunkard and a butcher stood beside Ning Ke and looked at him quietly, as if they were waiting for him to say something. All these gazes gathered on Ning Ke, as if he represented some kind of hope. The feeling of being watched by the whole world was very strange. The feeling of being regarded as hope was very strange. Ning Ke felt that he had suddenly become great and noble, and even sacred. But he was just a very ordinary person, and he did not know what was going on in the world that was about to turn into night. So he was very afraid and uneasy, and his heart palpitated so much that he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Chapter 27. Ning Ke woke up from the pain and his eyes were full of horror. He tore off his clothes and searched his chest nervously with his hands. He only felt his hands were slippery with sweat, but he did not feel the broken heart hanging outside his broken sternum. He could not help but pat his chest in fear. It took a long time for his rapid breathing to calm down again. He looked at Sang Sang who was sleeping soundly at his feet and the lovely sweat on the tip of the little girl's black nose. He suddenly felt that being alive was a very happy thing. He was not going to tell Sang Sang about the strange dream that brought him great fear. He was not going to tell anyone about it because he would feel very uncomfortable even if he only thought of a fragment of the dream. So he decided to forget about it. The next day, the shabby horse carriage set off with a squeaking sound and continued southward along with the convoy of cavalries. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning when the procession stopped in a small town outside Chang'an. The messengers from the capital, the representatives of the court officials, and the princess's complicated guard of honor had been waiting for the princess's return in this small town since a few days ago. Ning Ke jumped off the shaft of the carriage and stood at the edge of the noisy procession. He looked towards the sky outside the town and could vaguely see the gray outline of the city. However, it was a little far away and he could not make the gray outline clearer even if he tried hard to pull the corner of his eyes. He could only guess in his heart that it should be Chang'an. The huge and complicated guard of honor slowly set off again. This time, no one asked the master and the servant to go together. Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood by the roadside, looking at the luxurious and spacious carriage that slowly passed by them. Looking at the tightly closed window, he thought of the princess and the strong-headed little prince of the barbarian tribe inside, and the bonfire. He could not help but touch his face, and then he smiled. When the fourth horse carriage passed by them, a corner of the curtain was lifted. Liu Qingchen gently stroked his white beard and smiled at Ning Ke, who was standing by the road. Ning Ke deeply bowed to the ground to return the greeting. When the bodyguards and the grassland barbarians passed by Ning Ke, they did not dismount from their horses but bowed to bid farewell with apologetic smiles on their faces. The Imperial Guard of Honor was strict. Peng Guotao, the bodyguard leader, would have a bright future after returning to Chang'an. However, he dared not act rashly in front of the officials of the court. As for the grassland barbarians, after they bid farewell to Ning Ke with their hands folded in front of their chest, their expressions became much more relaxed and happy. Without the shadow of the woodcutters of Shubi Lake around them, the prosperous days of Chang and in their imagination suddenly became lively and cheerful. The cavalrymen from the Gushan commandery, who were responsible for bringing up the rear, looked around vigilantly and held the reins with one hand. Their commander, Hua Shangyue, glanced at Ning Ke and then sped up. It was as if Ning Ke did not exist in his eyes at all. Perhaps he had really forgotten the existence of this insignificant person. Ning Ke should not care about the other's attitude. After entering Chang'an, the other was the son of a noble family and the most outstanding figure in the younger generation of the Tang military. Now that he had been released from the military, he was just a commoner at the bottom. If he was lucky enough to enter the academy, he would just be an inconspicuous brick in the imperial bureaucracy. No matter how he looked at it, he would no longer have anything to do with Hua Shangyue, who had once shown hostility and even killing intent. But would he be willing to let his life pass like this? He would not, so he was very clear that he and this proud young general would meet again one day, and that day should not be too far away. After the princess carriage and the escorting cavalries left, the number of people in the town suddenly decreased by more than half. However, it became much livelier than before. The peddlers who did not dare to set up their stalls just now came out of nowhere. The stalls that were closed to avoid trouble also reopened their doors and began to seize the time to do business. After selling the broken carriage at a broken price to a shop in the town that even accepted broken goods, Ning Ke patted Song Song's thin shoulder to comfort her. The old carriage and horse had been with them for many years in the city of Wei, and they would be reluctant to sell it like this. However, Chang'an was right in front of them, and it was not appropriate to reminisce and be sentimental. They did not choose the spacious official road that could accommodate 8 carriages side by side. Instead, they strolled along the ridges beside the official road. The cauliflower in the field was in full bloom, the butterflies were slowly flapping their wings in the spring breeze, and the annoying bees were buzzing everywhere. The little handmaiden's tears gradually dried up. She held the lace of the parcel tightly with both hands and dragged the parcel that seemed to be bigger than her. She walked along the ridges and looked at it occasionally with a smile. Under the sun, Ning Ke took over the heavy parcel and chatted with the little handmaiden. Although he often did not get a response, he still enjoyed it. His eyes greedily swept over the farmland and the countryside. When he saw the farmers who were resting in the fields not far away, he waved his hand to greet them, and when he saw the butterflies flying in front of him, he was ready to pounce on them. He left Chang'an when he was very young. Since then, he had been living in the vast Min Mountain, the grassland, the wilderness, and small border towns. There were only dangerous forests, boring grasslands, and omnipresent dangers around him. Now that he had returned to the center of the empire, he could not hide his joy and excitement when he saw these peaceful and beautiful sceneries and life. About 2 or 3 hours later, a shadow suddenly spread from the stream and peach forest in front of them to the top of their heads. Ning Ke thought that it was not night yet, and there was no sign of rain in the sky. He looked up in confusion and saw a black city wall suddenly appearing in front of him. This city wall was so high that it seemed to have no end. It covered half of the sky and blocked the sun that had not yet set. Looking at it, he could vaguely see 3 black spots hovering in the sky above the city wall. Looking to the left, he could not see the end of the city wall. Looking to the right, he could not see the end of the city wall either. This huge city was so huge that it could not be seen how wide it was. It stood silently between heaven and earth. Sang Sang stared at the magnificent city in front of her and looked at the crowd on the road not far away. She asked, "Is this Chang'an?" The 3 black spots in the sky flew a little lower. It turned out that 2 eagles were practicing flying with their children. At this time, they were about to return to their nest, which was between the mottled city wall. The city wall had been washed by rain and weathered for thousands of years. The surface looked a little shabby, but the inside of the city wall was still indestructible. The young eagle learned to fly and returned to its nest. Ning Ke looked up at the world's most magnificent city with a sincere smile on his face. He had traveled outside for many years and finally came back today. Chang'an City, long time no see. Chapter 28. Chang'an, the most magnificent city in the world, naturally lived up to its reputation. Because the city was so huge, the empire had opened 18 city gates in the east, west, south, and north directions. But even so, the officials, nobles, and common people who entered and left the city still blocked these city gates from time to time, forming a long queue on the official road. Ning Ke and Sang Sang waited in the long queue until dusk. Ning Ke, who was sweating profusely, could not help but think of the big traffic jam in the capital of another world when he saw the solemn sergeants carefully checking their luggage. He shook his head and scolded them with a smile. He cursed in a low voice, but the residents of Chang'an around him cursed in a particularly loud voice. The people of the Tang Empire were simple and fierce. Few people were afraid of those seemingly solemn soldiers. However, no one dared to ignore the strict laws of the empire and barge in like this. Finally, it was Ning Ke and Sang Sang's turn. The soldier took the document from the military ministry that Ning Ke handed over and found that the lad was actually a comrade of his and had made many military achievements in the front line. The serious expression on his face suddenly became much gentler. However, when his gaze fell on the 3 hilts on Ning Ke's back, he could not help but frown. This is a family heirloom sword. My ancestor once told me. Ning Ke carefully explained. As long as the sword lives, the man lives. As long as the sword dies, the man dies. The sergeant glanced at him with boredom, waved his hand and said contemptuously, "I have to hear this 800 times a day. Little guy, save it. Take off your luggage. You two are so small. You don't look like you are here for an exam. It looks like you are moving house." He turned to look at the big black umbrella on Sang Sang's back, frowned and asked, "What kind of umbrella is this? Why is it so big?" Sang Sang held the middle part of the big black umbrella behind her back and looked up at the sergeant coldly. She said, "As long as the umbrella lives, the man lives. As long as the umbrella dies, the man dies." The sergeant looked at the little black girl and gave her a thumbs up. He praised, "That's creative." Ning Ke was untying his bag with a bitter smile on his young face. He thought to himself that he was probably the only one in the world who knew that Sang Sang's words were not a joke. There were bedding, blankets, and other miscellaneous items in the large bundle. The only thing worth paying special attention to was the boxwood bow and the quiver of arrows. When the soldier flipped through these items, his expression changed slightly. The city gate of Chang'an was long and dark. The exit on the other side of the city was very far away and looked like a small hole that could light up. One could vaguely see the setting sun in the distance. The red light slanted in but was swallowed up by the darkness and noise before it could spread far. Ning Ke and Sang Sang followed the crowd to that place. Sang Sang weighed the heavy bag on her back to make it more comfortable on her shoulders. She asked curiously, "Young master, Are all the people in Chang'an as talkative as that soldier? Almost. Ning Ke answered, all the wealth and power in the world are concentrated in this city. It's inevitable that the people in Chang'an are a little arrogant. But the more arrogant they are, the more polite and tolerant they appear to be to outsiders. That's because they want to show their elegance. And they are indeed a group of very elegant fellows. But if they don't show their arrogance, anyone would feel anxious. What about the people in Chang'an? They talk. From horse carriages to government offices, all the people in Chang'an are very good at chatting. From the secrets of the royal family to the anecdotes of brothels, it seems that there is nothing in the world that they don't know. Of course, what they like most is to talk about the wars and affairs of the countries or the counties of the Tang Empire in a light tone, as if each of them is a prime minister. Sang Sang giggled, which showed that she was really amused by Ning Ke's words. Previously, when they were checked at the city gate, there was no tragic scene of people being killed or their swords destroyed. Now the big black umbrella was on Ning Ke's back, and the 3 swords on Ning Ke's back were put into his bag. The boxwood bow was also unstrung. After that, the talkative soldier let them go without making things difficult for them. The Tang people worshipped martial arts. If they didn't have a few weapons at hand, it would be more painful than killing them. Therefore, the empire had always been very lax in this aspect. In Chang'an, people were allowed to carry swords, but not knives. They were allowed to carry bows and arrows, but they had to be unstrung. Crossbows were forbidden. Other than that, there were no other restrictions. As for whether one would secretly knock the bowstring and take out the saber after entering the city, no one would care. The Chang'an local government would not care. The military ministry would not care. Even the emperor in the palace would not care about these things. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were used to living in the frontier fortress. Every night in the city of Wei, there were no lights except for the taverns. Apart from the soldiers gambling, there were no other sounds. Therefore, when they entered Chang'an at dusk, they thought that they would see a quiet city about to sleep. Unexpectedly, at night, Chang'an was still. Everywhere was lively. The street was full of lights, which illuminated the flat bluestone road as if it were daytime. The pedestrians on the street were weaving, either stopping in front of the stalls or pointing at the stars to look at the sky. The men and women who stopped in front of the stalls were already together, while the men who pointed at the stars to look at the sky had probably just begun the process of hooking up. The Tang people, especially those in Chang'an, wore simple and plain clothes. They wore tight sleeves, short shirts, and flat shoes, which made them look particularly neat. Occasionally, there were men with wide sleeves, whose cuffs were also very short. Their hands hung out of the sleeves, which should make it easier for them to pull out the sharp sword in the sheath at their waist. There was a man in a green robe walking with a sword, and his long beard fluttered in the night wind. He looked like an otherworldly swordsman. However, when he saw a juggler on the street, he would also stop and crowd with a group of girls. He would stare nervously, and then clap his hands and cheer loudly. However, when the jugglers collected the money, he would return to the cold look of an otherworldly swordsman, which meant that it was impossible for him to take out dirty things like copper coins. The women in Chang'an were also very simple and plain. In other words, they were cool, and in other words, they were naked. In this early warm spring season, the women and girls on the street all had their arms exposed outside their sarong sleeves. There were even some charming young women who were bold enough to wear a tube top on the street, which attracted people's attention with their white and tender breasts. On the street, bare-chested barbarians looked around curiously with wineskins tied around their necks. The officials of the Yueluan kingdom, wearing winged hats, stroked their beards and shuttled between the taverns and brothels. The merchants of the South Jin kingdom leaned against the railings upstairs, watching the stars and drinking. From time to time, their pretentious laughter spread to the street, and a melodious melody came from some house. The wealth, romance, and temperament of the whole world seemed to be concentrated in Chang'an. It was so warm that it made people excited and intoxicated. Magnificence and gentleness coexisted, and swords and beauties reflected each other. Ning Ke held Sangsang's little hand and walked in the sea of lights and people. His stunned and admiring look was very much like that of a brother and sister from the countryside. There was a verdant bird's head for drawing eyebrows, a fragrant millet butterfly powder, jade hairpin powder, and pearl powder on the face. Was that thing called rose cream rouge? Was that small bottle the legendary floral water? Sang, whose hand was held by Ning Ke, widened her willow leaf-like slender eyes and looked at the bottles and jars on the street stalls. She felt that she could not walk anymore. There was a young lady swaying her waist and walking in front of her. How could her plump buttocks under the skirt be so bouncy? A young girl with a drooping ponytail squeezed past her with a giggle. Why did her faint body smell like an orchid? Why did she wink at those charming young women who were picking flowers for men at the stalls? Did she think that the young man was a little cute? Ning Ke held Sangsang's hand and looked around happily. He did not remember that Chang'an was such a unique place when he was young. He felt that he could not walk anymore. Since they could not walk anymore, they walked slowly. The street finally became a little quieter. However, before the two visitors from the border town could calm down and relax, they heard a shout in front of them. Countless people of Chang'an poured out from all directions and blocked a street corner in front of them. Duel! Through the dense crowd, they could vaguely see two men with swords on their waists staring at each other with hatred. Both of their right sleeves were cut off by swords and thrown on the ground between them. The world became quiet. All the onlookers tightly shut their mouths. Ensuring the fairness of the duel was deeply rooted in the blood of every Tangs. Even onlookers had their own rules. The rule of the duel is that cutting one's sleeve represents a challenge. If you accept, you have to cut off a piece of your sleeve. Ning Ke took Sangsang's hand and squeezed out of the crowd. He explained to her, this kind of duel is called a live game. It's fine as long as there is a winner. There is another kind of duel called a dead game. It needs to be confirmed by the government. The challenger of the dead game has to cut his left palm. If the opponent accepts, he has to do the same. Can I not accept? Sang asked. Of course. Ning Ke wiped the sweat off his forehead and patted the big bag on Sangsang's back to make sure there was no thief. Then he continued, but sometimes people, especially men, can easily become idiots. For example, when they go crazy for women, love, dignity, and other messy things. The two of them squeezed out of the crowd. Sang looked up and asked confusedly, why don't we stay and watch? I remember that you liked to watch when we were in the city of Wei. You squatted by the side and watched the whole night when the pig was being killed. I've seen a lot of cows and sheep. That year, the pig was killed for the first time in the history of the city of Wei. Of course I have to watch it carefully. Things like duels happen every day in Chang'an. If you want to watch it, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future. Ning Ke said calmly, moreover, this is Chang'an. I just want to study in the academy. I don't want to cause any trouble. From now on, we have to be like two dogs and behave with our tails between our legs. Sang shook her head and thought to herself, I don't want to be a bitch. As for you, young master, just kill less people in Chang'an. It's not suitable for you to behave with your tails between your legs. Let's find an inn. Ning Ke seemed to read her mind and said with a sense of failure, I'm sleepy. Sang pointed to a building on the street ahead and said, look, there's an inn. Chapter 29. Of course, the name of the inn was not really Room Inn. They spent a night there. Ning Ke and Sang rubbed their eyes and yawned as they walked out of the door of the inn. They did not remember the name of the inn. They found a kind-looking old woman on the street and asked for directions. Then they walked toward the South City. They asked for directions again and again through the alleys and streets, and finally saw two big locust trees. From the moment they saw the locust trees, memories that should have been vague but were actually very clear flooded into Ning Kei's mind. He closed his eyes and thought for a while, and then walked over with Sang Sang. There was a quiet alley between the two big locust trees. It was wide enough for a horse carriage to pass, but it did not look luxurious. There was no sound coming from the houses on both sides of the street. Many towering trees stretched out from the walls of the courtyards, covering the heads of people in twos and threes. The trees covered the spring sunshine and gave the place a cool shade. They walked to the middle of the alley and saw two mansions facing each other. The stone lion on the right side of the steps was very clean, with no obvious dust or fallen leaves on it. The red door was tightly shut, and the brass ring was silent. On the other hand, the one on the left was in a much more dilapidated state. The paint on the door was peeling off, and the two seals were floating weakly in the wind. There was only one stone lion left, and the other one had been moved somewhere. Even the one that was left was already dilapidated. It was missing an ear and a claw, and the back of the pedestal was covered in black mud that somewhat resembled congealed blood. Ning Zhiyong looked at the broken stone lion in front of him, and remembered the time when he played with Xiao Shun beside the lion when they were young, and then they were punished by the adults in the mansion. Then they walked through the alley, and he seemed to see the scene when he bravely ran away from home with the little guy to avoid the teacher's wooden board when he was 4 years old. Song Song's eyes moved back and forth between the two doors and Ning Kei's face. She felt that he was gloomy and sad at the moment. She did not know why, but she also felt sad and felt that the wind in the alley was a little cold. That dilapidated yard was the mansion of the former Xianwei general, Lin Guangyuan. In the first year of the Tianqi era, when the emperor was inspecting the southern swamp, a case of treason broke out in Chang'an. The prince personally presided over the trial, with the prime minister and other ministers watching from the side. In the end, Lin Guangyuan was convicted of treason, and the whole Lin family was executed. This case had long been treated as an ironclad case, and no one in the imperial court thought of reversing the verdict. Even if some people remembered the incident, they would occasionally think of the servants and stewards who should not have died. They would feel sorry for them and hate Lin Guangyuan even more. This man had committed a heinous crime. Not only had he caused his own death, but he had also implicated so many innocent people. In the 10 years after the general's mansion was taken back by the imperial court, it had been bestowed several times. However, when the officials who received the bestowment heard that it was a dangerous place, they all politely declined. There were many large mansions in Chang'an, so they were not afraid of not having a place to live. However, as a result, this mansion had long been empty in this street, and it had become more and more dilapidated. When walking through the gate of the general's mansion, Ning Kei's eyes flashed with sadness, and no other strange emotions could be seen on his face. He did not stop, and even his footsteps did not slow down. He was still walking as usual, so Sang Sang, who was carrying the big black umbrella, had to keep up with him as usual. The big black umbrella bounced off the little girl's back and then fell back, making a pa sound like a drum that represented the passage of time. The two of them walked calmly through the long alley, between the vermilion door and the broken door. They were like two ordinary tourists who had mistakenly entered a street in Chang'an in spring. No one wants that haunted house, but the house opposite is very popular. Why? Back then, the Xianwei general and the minister of council lived opposite each other. The Xianwei general's entire family was executed, but the minister of council rose to the top and is now a scholar of the imperial library. How many 4th and 5th ranked officials would want to take advantage of the mansion he once lived in? At the corner of a restaurant at the end of the street, Ning Kei and Sang Sang sat at a small table in the corner, quietly eating dishes and drinking porridge, but listening to the idle chatter of the old neighbors. For these old neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, or even generations, the most worthwhile things for them to talk about were naturally the treason case of the general's mansion and the path of the official of council. They did not get tired of talking about these things every day, which suited the master and servant's wishes. Speaking of scholar Xing Jing, he was just an official of council back then, but then he suddenly rose rapidly. There's a wonderful thing about this, I wonder if you've heard of it. Back then, this matter was so big that even the palace made a statement. Who in this market hasn't heard of it? A middle-aged man shook his head and said sarcastically, a dignified official of council married a fierce wife. The wife of the legal wife, out of jealousy, even tried to hurt the concubine's belly. That's not surprising. As a result, the concubine went through all kinds of hardships to give birth, and she still wanted to hurt the poor child. In the end, if the palace didn't issue an order, who knows what would have happened in the mansion. You only know that the palace issued an order, but do you know who did it? The man who spoke earlier sneered and bowed toward the north of Chang'an City. Let me tell you, it was the Empress Saint Emperor who flew into a rage after knowing about this. She personally wrote a letter to Lord Xing Jing, ordering him to discipline his wife. Her Majesty, the people who were drinking at the table looked at each other and smiled knowingly. Everyone in the world knew that the Tang Empire had an extremely great empress who was deeply loved and trusted by His Majesty. She even had the power to read memorials and judge officials. However, this empress was just a very ordinary concubine in the palace. In the words of the common people, she was His Majesty's concubine, and later remarried and became the legal wife. With such a background, everyone could guess the reason why the Empress was so concerned about the affairs of the official of council's mansion and was so angry because the official's wife abused his concubine and murdered her child. Lord Xing Jing's legal wife was born in a prominent family in Qinghe Prefecture, and it was precisely because of this that he had been tolerating her. However, he didn't expect that the cowardly civil official in the eyes of others could be so ruthless. After the Empress's letter was sent to the mansion, Lord Xing Jing gathered his family that very night and publicly beat 3 stewards who murdered his concubine's child. Then he sent his wife back to Qinghe Prefecture with 2 slaps and a small sedan chair. He divorced his wife so cleanly. Speaking of which, the reason why the official was so decisive back then was probably because he had no choice but to protect himself under the Empress's power. However, he didn't expect that he would do it so cleanly that he won the favor of the Empress. She felt that he was a useful person, and because of some other reasons, the official was able to become an official and is now in the Imperial Library. It is said that fortune and misfortune come hand in hand, but who would dare to imagine that having a fierce wife who killed his concubine and son would eventually lead to a man's official career? Chapter 30. Everyone around the table sighed. Ning Kei and Sang Sang sat in the corner, playing with the shredded pickles in the plate and listening silently. The sound of them drinking porridge was also very sad. He didn't have much of an impression of Sir Xing Jing, but he had a deep impression of his wife who was as fierce as a tiger. He didn't know who was right or wrong in this family fight that had spread to the palace. Anyway, it had nothing to do with him. He was more concerned about the situation in the First Minister's mansion. Compared with Lord Xing Jing, General Lin Guanyuan is really unlucky. That's not right. He dared to commit treason, so he should die 1,000 times. But the people in the mansion are really pitiful. The old man picked up the tip of his chopsticks and broke the salted egg on the plate. He drank a mouthful of the cheap lotus white inside. None of you have seen it with your own eyes. I happened to be there that day. The sound of killing shook the heavens in the general's mansion. Heads fell like watermelons falling to the ground. That blood overflowed from under the door. I don't want to speak for the traitor. It's just that sometimes I feel sad when I think about it. At that time, the neighbors all knew that there were several officials in the imperial court who were good friends with Xianwei General. But after the incident, no one stood up for the general, and no one even collected the corpse. The old man put down his wine cup and looked around the restaurant subconsciously. He looked at the street outside the door and said in a low voice, "Have you heard of Huang Xing, the city gate officer? He was brought back by Xianwei general from the frontier fortress. He was the one who first accused the general of treason. Where is he now? He has joined the prince and is doing well now. And the Zhaowu commandant is said to be doing well now. I don't know if these people will think of the heads in Xianwei general's mansion when they are indulging in debauchery every day. If so, how do they feel?" The chopsticks dipped into the egg yolk and ate the wine. Although it was slow, it was still finished. The idlers around the table drank up the daily lotus white wine set by the fierce wife at home. Then they stopped chatting and bid farewell with a smile. Ning Kai and Sang Sang were still sitting at the small table in the corner. The porridge on the table was already cold. The edges of the pickled cabbage were blown by the wind, but they obviously had no intention of leaving. "Young master, what is your relationship with the general's mansion?" Sang Sang looked at him and asked seriously. Ning Kai answered with a smile, "Of course. I'm asking, what's the relationship, not whether there's a relationship or not," Sang Sang corrected her seriously. After a moment of silence, Ning Kai gradually stopped smiling and said seriously, "But I can't tell you about this relationship. You're my maid now. If you tell anyone, the imperial court will execute us together." Sang Sang looked into his eyes and knew he was joking. She shook her head and said, "Young master, you are talking nonsense. In my great Tang, the number of people killed by nonsense is no less than the number killed by the barbarians." Ning Kai laughed and replied, "Sometimes we all know what's going on, but we can't say it, because once we say it, someone will die. So when we have to say it, we can just keep talking nonsense." After saying this, he picked up the wooden chopsticks again and rolled up the sleeve of his right hand. His gaze moved back and forth between the 5 small plates of pickled vegetables and the 2 bowls of cold porridge on the table, hesitating over what to do next to kill time. At this time, a young man walked into the restaurant. He was very thin and looked very ordinary. The most obvious feature was his dark complexion. His face was much darker than Song Song's, like the bottom of an iron pan that had been used for many years. Sang Sang probably rarely saw someone darker than her. She could not help but raise her head and look at him curiously. However, she felt that it was a little impolite. When she was about to look away, she was surprised to find that the dark and thin young man was walking toward the corner. Her body slightly stiffened and her right hand reached behind her back to hold the middle of the black umbrella. The dark and thin man did not come for them. He sat at the table next to them and reached out his hand to order some food and wine. Sang Sang relaxed a little and did not notice that the dark and thin man was sitting very close to Ning Quebec. When the dark and thin man walked into the restaurant, Ning Kai did not recognize him. After all, when they met in the forest of the Yan territory, they were still very young. The dark and thin man called him Little Ning and he called him Little Blackie. Now, after so many years, Ning Kai had become a teenager and the dark and thin man had become a calm young man. Ning Kai picked up a pickled vegetable with his chopsticks and put it into his mouth. He chewed it like a girl who could not help covering her mouth and giggling. After chewing a few times, he found that it was the vinegar pickled vegetable head that he disliked the most and Song Song's favorite. "It seems that you have been doing well these years," he said while holding back his laughter. Song Song's chopsticks had just reached the side of the vinegar pickled vegetable head. She showed a slight look of complaint on her face and wondered why the young master had changed his temper today to compete with her for this food. When she suddenly heard Ning Kai's question, she realized that he should be asking the dark and thin man who had just walked in. Her chopsticks froze on the side of the plate. The dark and skinny man's shoulders twitched as if he was trying to hold back his laughter. He said, "I'm not as good as you. How could you pass the initial examination of the academy? You even tricked that little girl into becoming your handmaiden. You're so King wicked." Speaking of which, she doesn't seem to recognize me anymore. How old was she 7 years ago? She wasn't a genius like me, who was born with knowledge. Ning Ke picked up the bowl of porridge and said angrily, "Let's get down to business. How many of those bastards did you help me find out who killed my family? And how many of those who slaughtered your entire village and helped Xiahou cover up?" The dark and thin young man answered, "Everyone in the world knows who first accused Lin Guangyuan of treason. However, it is not so clear about the few guys who came out to testify and make it an ironclad case. I only found out that 2 guys were released from prison 8 years ago and are still in Chang'an City. It's wonderful to say that these 2 guys are not doing well now. I don't know if they will regret the decision they made back then." Ning Ke did not turn back and thought in silence. But the dark and thin young man suddenly turned back and said with a frown, "Why do we have to sit back to back? Why do we have to make so many turns to send a letter? Where did you learn these messy things? Why do I always feel that we are like spies from the enemy country meeting?" Ning Ke helplessly covered his forehead and sighed. Looking at the dark and simple face, he said, "Damn it, didn't you say that you are working undercover in some gang under the order of the military ministry? I didn't know that you spies are so unprofessional." The dark and thin young man laughed and opened his arms. He said, "Who cares about being spies? After so many years, I have to see what you and Sang Sang have become." Ning Ke opened his arms reluctantly and hugged the man in the dark corner of the shabby restaurant. The dark and thin young man was called Joyer. He was Ning Ke's first friend in the world. The 2 of them met at a very coincidental time and also for a very coincidental reason. It was so coincidental that the 2 of them decided to become each other's companions in life and never leave each other's side in the time it took to tell 2 stories. Because they had the same goal in life, to kill Xiahou. Or that prince. Chapter 31. In the 6th year of the Tianqi era, the Tang Empire and the Yan Kingdom went to war. General Xiahou led the right army and did not arrive on time and was severely reprimanded by the imperial court. General Xiahou reported that they encountered the Yan Kingdom's ambush at the Yellow Wind Ridge and the right army killed them before chasing after them. The people in Chang'an did not know that the Yan cavalry that Xiahou led on the right side of the army and killed were actually the border residents of the Yellow Wind Ridge. Several villages were slaughtered by the right side of the army and Xiahou used the heads of the strong men of the villagers to pretend to be the leader of the cavalry. After that, he pushed the responsibility of the villages to the Yan Kingdom. The massacre of an entire village was a big deal anywhere, especially in the Tang Empire. Therefore, the imperial court did not believe Xiahou's explanation and sent competent officials to investigate. However, those villages had already been massacred and there was no witness. The investigating officials also had some problems. Therefore, the imperial court later concluded that Xiahou was telling the truth. Because of the massacre, the Yan Kingdom sacrificed a large piece of fertile land in the west of the river and sent the crown prince as a hostage to barely appease the Tang Empire's anger. However, not many people knew that the villagers who had their heads chopped off and burned were crying in the underworld. No one knew that a dark and thin teenager had escaped from the village. That dark and thin teenager was Joyer. He met Ning Ke by the Min Mountain and was taken away by a cultivator. Until today. Hey, what state are you in now? No doubt state or see-through state. Yo, a cultivation idiot like you actually knows about states? Of course. Cultivation is such a simple thing. It's very stupid. Ning Ke was actually just showing off the knowledge he had just learned in front of a friend whom he had not met for a long time. See-through state my ass. My poor but respectable master had just stepped into the no doubt state on the day he died. As for the poor and sad me, I'm still struggling in the initial state. Otherwise, I wouldn't need to be AF * king spy. Ning Ke looked at him mockingly and said, I really don't know what that old man saw in you back then. I begged him to go with me, but he didn't want me. Instead, he saw you as a silly charcoal head. Surprisingly, Zhuo'er didn't refute. After a long silence, he said, "Little Ning, in fact, I've been thinking that I didn't learn anything from my master. You're so smart. If you followed my master at that time, would it have been better? At least, you wouldn't be like me now. I've been in the army for so many years, but I still haven't been able to get close to Xiahou. I can't get any news from the upper echelons no matter how hard I ask." Ning Ke looked at him quietly and suddenly laughed. He said, "Who said you didn't find out anything? At least now we know how many times Xiahou goes to the bathroom a day, don't we? These things won't help in killing him. It's helpful." Ning Ke looked into his eyes seriously and said, "On the way here, I killed a group of Xiahou's assassins. It's all thanks to the information you've given me all these years." Zhuo'er was very clear about the strength of the assassins under Xiahou's command. He looked at the lad in front of him in shock. He couldn't understand what kind of adventure this lad had encountered in the 7 years that he hadn't seen him. How could he be able to do such a thing? However, he didn't voice out the doubts in his heart. He just smiled and asked, "How does it feel to kill Xiahou's men for the first time?" "It feels good." Ning Ke recalled the feeling when he slashed out 3 times and said slowly. Suddenly, he frowned and stared at Zhuo'er's dark face. He said, "It won't be good if people find out about our relationship. Chang'an is very big. Don't think that you can see enemies all the time. Moreover, you should understand one thing. To those bigwigs, the people of the general's mansion are all dead, and our village has also been slaughtered. Therefore, you and I are people who don't exist. Naturally, no one will be wary of us. Speaking of which, you're the official handyman of General Xiahou's bodyguard team. How did you suddenly become the golden hatchet man of the Goldfish Gang?" "I followed my boss back to the capital to report on my work. I didn't expect the military to ask me to be a spy. Besides, our gang isn't called the Goldfish Gang. It's called the Fish Dragon Gang. My boss asked me to keep an eye on our gang leader because some people suspect that he has something to do with the Yueluan kingdom. You know, many businesses of the nobles in the imperial court, even the transportation of military supplies, sometimes rely on these gangs to maintain order. If they collude with the enemy country, there will be serious problems." "Our gang leader?" Ning Ke frowned and looked at him. He said, "There's something wrong with these 4 words. It means that you respect this gang leader very much. You've even treated yourself as a popular hatchet man in the gang. Darky, you have to wake up. Although I've never been an undercover, I've seen a lot. I know that you can't get emotional when you're an undercover. Once you get emotional, you'll end up in a miserable state. Our gang leader is a good man." Zhuo'er lowered his head and kept silent for a long time. Then he raised his head and looked at Ning Ke seriously. He said, "Actually, he should have seen through my identity, but he didn't do anything to me." Ning Ke wanted to persuade him further, but Zhuo'er raised his right hand and firmly refused. He said, "He's my big brother, a big brother whom I respect very much. You don't have to persuade him anymore. On the contrary, I have something to ask of you. If anything happens to me in the future, I hope that you can repay my big brother's kindness when it's convenient for you." Ning Ke was silent and looked at him quietly. He didn't know what had happened in the biggest gang in Chang'an, but he could tell that Zhuo'er was serious. He couldn't help but be curious about his big brother. What kind of Jianhu bigshot was that Zhuo'er was so convinced that he couldn't repay his big brother's kindness even after his death? At the end of their first conversation after 7 years, the two of them briefly talked about the recent situation. After hearing about the assassination on Northern Mountain Road, Zhuo'er was shocked and asked, "It's such a good opportunity. Why don't you get in touch with the princess? Even if her social class is too far apart from ours, as long as you bring out the same stubbornness that you used to pester my master, who in this world can refuse you?" Ning Ke shook his head and said firmly, no. The princess seems to be wise and thoughtful, but she's actually a naive, stupid, and idiotic idiot. If I follow her, I might lose my life at any time. They parted at the small restaurant. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left first and began to ask for directions again and again. When they were about to reach the market where the inn was located, it began to rain. With a bang, the big black umbrella bloomed over their heads like a black lotus, shielding them from the rain. Sang Sang held the umbrella handle tightly with both hands, raised her little face, and asked in confusion, "Why do you always say that the princess is an idiot? In fact, she's really a good person." Really a good person. Ning Ke looked at the road in the rain and shook his head slowly. The Vermilion Bird Avenue, which led directly to the Imperial Palace in the north, was originally gray, but became black after being soaked by the rain. Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood on the side of the road and looked at it. They only felt like a black, long, and straight ribbon, which was worn on the chest of the magnificent Chang'an city. It was elegant, solemn, and frightening, especially the vermilion bird carved in the middle of the avenue. Its two eyes stared at them without anger, as if it was about to fly up from among the stones and pounce on them. Under the black umbrella, the master and the handmaiden felt the ancient murderous intent at the same time. Fear surged out from the deepest part of their bodies. Their hands that were holding each other instantly became extremely cold, and they were so stiff that they couldn't move. Holding the big black umbrella, they struggled to stand on the side of the road for a long time. They didn't come to their senses until the wind and rain finally stopped. The sun shone on the long street again, and the pedestrians walked around them. Looking at it, the vermilion bird deeply engraved on the imperial road did not change at all. Chapter 32. When they woke up in the inn the next morning, they washed up and got ready to dress up. They had to go through the procedures and get the certificate of admission to the academy, so they wanted to look good. Ning Ke sat in front of the window and looked at the book in the morning. He squinted his eyes and was ready to enjoy Sang Sang combing his hair. He did not expect his hair to be pulled and felt a sharp pain. He turned around and looked at the little girl helplessly. "Is it so hard to comb my hair? Young master, why don't you try it yourself? In the past, you just casually combed your hair into a bun in the city of Wei, but today you want to learn from those scholars." "I have never learned that." Sang Sang retracted her hand that was holding the comb and said angrily. "Look at your attitude. You also know to call me young master." Ning Ke said angrily, "Who is the young master and who is the girl? I just said a few words and you asked me to comb my hair myself. You have to understand that I will enter the academy soon and become a serious scholar. If you don't know how to do it, then go and learn it. You have to comb your hair like that every day." Ever since yesterday, when they saw that painting in the rain on Vermilion Bird Avenue, the master and servant pair's emotions had always been a bit problematic. However, they simply couldn't understand what they felt at that time, and even more so couldn't be sure if what they felt at that time was real. Moreover, there were some very obscure reasons, so they hadn't talked about this matter. Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang's face, which was darker than before, and said with a smile, "Okay, okay. I will take you to Chenjinji Cosmetics Store after we finish our business." Hearing this, Sang Sang raised her little face and smiled. She turned around and took out a knife from her bag and handed it to him. Ning Ke took the knife and walked into the small courtyard at the back of the inn. He began to practice with the knife in the morning light. His movements were precise and fierce, but his messy and fluffy hair shook with his movements, which made him look a little funny. The Tang Empire was the center of the whole world. Chang'an was a place respected and worshipped by thousands of countries. The academy, in a sense, was the center of the Tang Empire. It was a place that was respected and worshipped by thousands of people. Sometimes, the influence of the academy even surpassed that of the royal family. Ever since he knew about the academy when he was a child, Ning Ke's brain, which had been washed by vulgar conspiracy theories, had never figured out why the Tang Empire, or the royal family, would allow such a place to exist. As the saying went, there was only one sky above one's head, and there was only one sun in the sky. Then how could there be two voices in an empire? No matter whether he could figure it out in the future or not, at least this day's experience finally made him feel the lofty status of the academy in the Tang Empire. He also realized the respect and even awe the imperial court had for the academy. It was just a simple certificate of eligibility for the academy entrance examination, but it required 3 of the 6 departments to stamp it. Furthermore, only officials above the rank of Lang Zhong were qualified to do this. In the military ministry, the Ministry of Personnel, and the Ministry of Rights, Ning Ke had seen more officials above the 5th rank today than he had seen in the past 16 years. If not for the fact that his military status had not been changed to civilian status, he would even need to go to the Yamen of the Ministry of Revenue. Although the spring day was warm and pleasant, he was still sweating profusely after going through so much trouble in the north city of Chang'an. He could not help but think that even if the imperial court wanted to send troops to the South Jin Kingdom, they would not need to go through so much trouble. The imperial ministry was a place with a strict hierarchy. Ning Ke was just a small soldier from a border town with no background. He had thought that he would be treated with contempt and coldness. However, when the officials saw his name, they did not make things difficult for him as General Ma Shixiang had warned them. They just waved their hands and let him pass. Ning Ke thought about it carefully and realized that the princess had sent someone to greet him. The princess had returned from the grassland and encountered an assassination on her way back. When she returned to Chang'an, she must have been congratulated by hundreds of officials, held a banquet in the palace, and secretly investigated. If it had been someone else, they would have been very grateful for him. However, he did not think so, because this was something that he had previously discussed with Her Highness. Although they had discussed it beside the fire, Her Highness did not act like a highness. After stamping the last stamp in the Ministry of Rights, the sun had already begun to set in the west. Fortunately, the Tang Empire's bureaucracy was not too bureaucratic and was quite efficient. The Yamen responsible for issuing the certificate of eligibility for the academy entrance examination was not far from the Ministry of Rights, and it was still open at this time. There were 2 or 3 young people who had just received the certificate and were whispering at the door. It's not a good idea to stay in all the time. I can't get to know my classmates. It's not bad to move to the academy in advance. Maybe I can get to know some senior brothers and sisters. It's not cheap to live in the academy. It's even more expensive than the best ULI in Chang'an. Speaking of which, it was better during the time of Emperor Taizu. At that time, the academy didn't have to pay for food and accommodation. There's no need to save money. In my opinion, it's good to go to the academy one day earlier. If you can familiarize yourself with the environment, you will have a higher chance of passing the academy entrance examination. I heard that the military ministry went crazy this time and recommended more than 70 candidates. Ning Ke was about to walk inside when he suddenly stopped and looked at the young scholar with hands folded in front. He asked, "Brother, did you just say that the academy doesn't provide food and accommodation now?" The 3 people looked at Ning Ke as if they were looking at an idiot. They probably wanted to say, "If you don't even know this, why do you want to enter the academy?" Ning Ke's favorite thing to do was to laugh at others for being idiots behind their backs. At this time, when someone said he was an idiot to his face, he naturally could not accept it, so he turned around and entered the door. When he came out again, the young scholars at the door were long gone. Otherwise, they would definitely mock him when they saw his pale face. Sang Sang had been waiting outside the door. She held the big black umbrella to block the sun from making her face darker. She was squinting at the good idea when she suddenly saw Ning Ke's appearance. She suddenly became nervous and trotted to him. She asked in a trembling voice, "What's wrong? The academy doesn't allow students to bring their handmaidens." Did you tell the adults inside that I can help the academy as long as I have a place to live? That's not the problem. Ning Kei's lips were a little dry. He looked at her and said in a slightly hoarse voice, I just asked clearly. The academy doesn't provide food and accommodation at all. That means if I pass the exam, I have to pay 30 taels of silver every month, 30 taels of silver. Sang Sang subconsciously raised her voice and screamed, then what's the point of studying? She knew it was meaningless when she said this. She frowned and looked at Ning Kei bitterly. She said, Young master, we have saved 76 taels of silver these years. We didn't spend a single copper coin on the way with the princess. Including the money from selling the carriage, the general's financial support and the gambling debts, we have less than 200 taels of silver. After arriving in Chang'an, we stayed in the inn for 2 days and had 5 meals. Ning Kei stopped the little handmaiden's nagging and said uneasily, the academy entrance exam will be held in a month. It seems that we have to stay in the inn for a month. You have to include this expense. If Sang Sang could see her face at this time, she would feel a little happier. Because her little black face had become much paler because of shock and uneasiness. Chapter 33. About the same time as yesterday, there was another spring rain in Chang'an City. The raindrops hit the thick surface of the big black umbrella and made muffled sounds, like water falling into dust. Not a single drop of rain could penetrate the surface of the umbrella. The area of the big black umbrella was large enough to shelter an entire football team from the wind and rain. But somehow, Ning Kei and Sang Sang still felt that they were drenched and their bodies were so cold that they were about to turn into ice sculptures. Let's find a place to hide from the rain, he said in a hoarse voice. Then he thought of the strange thing on the street yesterday and added, don't go to the Vermilion Bird Avenue. So the master and the servant walked aimlessly along the green trees on the street for some distance. Then they stood quietly under the eaves of a side street in the northern city of Chang'an and put away the black umbrella. Then they were silent for a long time, looking at the dense rain in front of them and the little water splashes in front of their boots. They were completely speechless. My great Tang Empire. Ning Kei said these 6 words in a tone without the usual confidence and pride. Instead, he said with some hidden bitterness. It's really shameful to rely on education to earn money. Even if you don't provide board and lodging, can't you charge me a little cheaper? And you should know that I saved your princess. Why did you just ask someone to pass a message? Why didn't you give us 1,000 or 800 taels of silver? That's not generous at all. She frowned and looked down at the water splashes on the bluestone. She counted with her fingers and said, we can't stay in an inn for more than a month. We don't have that much money. If you insist on taking the academy, then it's meaningless even if we go to a shabby temple. We only have less than 200 taels of silver, and we have to spend it every day. So our problem now is not how to save money, but how to earn money. How to earn money. The young man used the umbrella as a cane and sighed. That's a problem. The spring rain was pattering. The master and the servant were hiding from the rain on the street while worrying about the problem of making a living. Of course, hunting was out of the question. Not to mention the terrible 30 taels of silver a month, the key problem was that there was no hunting place near Chang'an. Ning Kei had realized this when he was in the city of Wei. The mountains and forests around Chang'an belonged to the old master of the emperor, so the prey in the mountains naturally belonged to the old master of the emperor. If he were to plunder all the prey in the mountains and forests within 2 months, he might be accused of stealing the royal gardens. Sang Sang looked up and said timidly, I can't do needlework. I carefully looked at the stalls on the street that night. The craftsmanship in Chang'an was much better than mine. There were many styles that I had never seen before, and I couldn't understand the needlework. Looking at the rain, Ning Sang Sang said, it is a pity that there are no horse gangs or mountain bandits around Chang's or around Chang. Otherwise, I would be. I was. When I was that I was. Mountain. I was. I horse. I and I king, I's a, when I realized the purpose of killing the horse gangs and collecting firewood, the horse gangs at Shubi Lake became poor again. Sang Sang scolded in a low voice, I told you at that time that you were too ruthless. As a result, the horse gang of Shubi Lake sent people to keep an eye on the city of Wei all day long. As soon as they found out that you led the team to the grassland, they immediately packed up their gold and silver and ran away. As a result, I didn't make any money last year. I was young and inexperienced. Ning Kei said awkwardly. Suddenly, he raised his eyebrows and said, how about joining a gang? I can't directly borrow money from Darky. But I can use his connections to join a gang. Then I can try to get a position in 10 days and collect money. You said that the academy will test the morality of the students. If the academy finds out that you are in a gang and bullies the good, they might just remove you from the list. Then you won't need to earn this money. Sang Sang reminded him. Ning Kei hated that his little handmaiden was always stupid and lazy when he needed to show her memory. But when he didn't need to show her memory, she was always smart and good at remembering. She was like a genius child. He said angrily, then what should I do? If I can make money without letting the academy know, then I can only be a killer. The problem is, where is the killer organization? I can't just meet a man in black on the street of Chang'an and ask, excuse me, I want to know how to get to the most powerful killer organization in the Tang Empire. Can you show me the way? Sang Sang was not afraid of his anger. She said seriously, young master, I know you feel ashamed. But we have to find a way to make money. Otherwise, we'd better go back to the city of Wei. I said I won't go back if I can't make a name for myself. Ning Kei said bitterly. In the Min Mountain, the city of Wei, and the grassland, he and Sang Sang could survive no matter how poor the situation was. But now that they were in the prosperous and affluent Chang'an, survival had become a serious problem for them. A penny could stump a hero, which was a rare headache for the master and the servant. Ning Kei's eyes suddenly lit up. He said, I know. We sell century eggs. No, I should say century eggs. Sang Sang frowned and repeated, century eggs. He smiled and said, without a doubt, the century eggs I make are the best in the Tang Empire. Sang Sang looked at him and said seriously, but the people in the city of Wei don't like it. I don't like it either. It's too bitter. Ning Kei stopped smiling. He looked at the pedestrians in the rain and pretended to be calm. He said, actually, I was joking. Sang Sang looked up at his chin. After hesitating for a long time, she plucked up her courage and said, young master, there's actually a very simple way to make money. I just don't know if you're willing to do it. Ning Kei turned his head and instantly felt that the little handmaiden's little black face had become more pleasing to the eye and beautiful than ever. He said gently, nowadays, as long as I can make money, there's nothing I'm not willing to do. Sang Sang replied, young master, your calligraphy is so good. Let's sell your calligraphy. Ning Kei's expression froze. He looked at her and said seriously, Sang Sang, you've become uglier. Sang Sang was confused. Ning Kei scolded angrily, what do you mean by selling calligraphy? That's calligraphy. Do you know what calligraphy is? How can you sell the things of a scholar? I'd rather sell my body than sell it. Sang Sang shouted angrily, young master, you're not a scholar. You're just a woodcutter. Don't you always say that you're better at writing than killing people? Since you're willing to kill people to make money, why can't you make money by writing? Ning Kei retorted weakly without much confidence, I've said that's not writing, it's called calligraphy. He lowered his head and looked at his shoes that were wet from the rain. He looked at the words that he had just written with the rainwater from the black umbrella. He knew that he had lost to the little handmaiden once again in life. The line of words written with rainwater was as follows: "Don't worry about being poor, worry about having a fierce maid at home." Chapter 34. You can sell it, but I have a condition. What is it, young master? You can't set up a stall on the street. You have to have a storefront. A storefront is very expensive. I want it to be expensive, because my calligraphy has to be expensive too. Otherwise, I can't afford to lose face. Okay, I'll listen to you. Ning Kai, who had been utterly defeated by the little handmaiden, still fought a difficult battle after he decided to surrender. After making sure that he could gain some benefits or face, he finally agreed to open a shop to sell calligraphy. Now, the most practical problem in front of them was how to find a suitable shop. Last night, when they wanted to find an inn, there was an inn. Today, when they wanted to find a shop, there was a sublet shop. Even Haotian, who favored the world, would not give too many opportunities for such a good thing. They had to find an intermediary for this kind of thing. The manager of the intermediary took out a map and pointed out the vacant shops for them like commanding an army. He casually mentioned a few prices. Then, under Sang Sang's strong request, they chose the area around the imperial city to the government offices. Then they moved to the north city to avoid the rich west city and the quiet south city. Finally, they settled on the east city, which was known for its messiness. Chang'an covered a large area, but it had a larger population. The rent for a shop could be said to be extremely expensive. Even in the eastern city, where the land was the cheapest, it was not cheap to find a suitable shop. The two of them had less than 200 taels of silver in total, so the choice was even smaller. For 2 consecutive days, they followed the manager of the real estate agency everywhere, but to no avail. On the 3rd day, there was finally good news. The manager, whose eyes were about to turn green, excitedly waved his arms and told Ning Kai that a small calligraphy shop on Lin 47th Street in the East City was going to change hands. It had all kinds of stationery. The monthly rent was 15 taels of silver, and the transfer fee was another 50 taels of silver. The lease still had a year and a half left. All these conditions were very suitable for Ning Kai, mainly for Sang Sang. Ning Kai and Sang Sang looked at each other and saw the surprise in each other's eyes. The price was indeed not high, and the location on the map was not bad. However, they had to see for themselves. Moreover, opening a shop to sell calligraphy was related to their survival in Chang'an for the next few years. Therefore, they did not immediately agree, but asked to go to the small calligraphy shop to have a look. The owner of the rental shop was not there, and neither was the previous owner. The steward opened the dusty wooden door with a key, and the 3 of them walked in. The shop was very small, with some banners hanging on the surrounding white walls. On the wooden shelves on the east wall, there were things like writing brushes, ink, paper, and grinders. The most satisfying thing was that there was a house at the back of the shop, and there was a well in the small house at the back. Ning Kai and Sang Sang looked around casually. Thinking of the low rent, they were somewhat willing. I don't want these paintings. You'll have to reduce the transfer fee. Ning Kai looked at the wall full of scrolls and the shabby handwriting on the scrolls. He frowned and said, although those brushes, ink, paper, and inkstones are not good things, they can still be used. I'll take them as a gift from you. Sang Sang looked up at Ning Kai with an admiring smile, thinking that the young master's words were very well said. The steward wanted to cry but had no tears. He thought to himself, I already know how stingy you two are these days, but I didn't expect you to be so stingy. I'm just a steward, not your enemy. What's the point of torturing me? After torturing and torturing, the matter was finally settled. Sang Sang took out a silver box from her bag and carefully counted it for a long time before handing over the agreed amount of silver. They signed a document. From this moment on, the small calligraphy shop on Lin 47th Street in the Eastern District officially belonged to Ning, Quebec. After sending off the steward with a smile, Sang Sang put down her bag and took out a handkerchief to cover her head and face. She also took out a big towel from somewhere and fetched a bucket of well water from the back of the house, ready to start cleaning. Thinking that they might have to sign the document today, the two checked out of the inn and carried their luggage here. They would not hesitate to save a day's inn fee. The steward obviously didn't notice this detail. Otherwise, he might have asked for a higher price, but it was more likely that he would be scared out of his wits by this stingy pair of master and servant. The small calligraphy shop was filled with the smell of dust and water. The thin Sang Sang laboriously moved the bucket of water, set up a stool, and squatted down to clean the shop. Occasionally, she raised her arm to wipe her forehead, which was not covered by the handkerchief, although there was no sweat on it. Ning Ke had never cared about such things. He took a stool and sat by the door. Looking at the corner of the imperial city that could be vaguely seen in the distance, the quiet Lin 47th Street, and the shadows of the locust trees on both sides of the street, he thought that the shop would definitely have a good business in the future. Moreover, he had only spent so little money. He could not help but feel gratified and shouted with a smile, "Young master, your hands are itching." The busy Sang Sang was obviously in a good mood today. She answered crisply, "Let's do it tonight." Okay. After a hasty dinner, Sang Sang spread out a roll of paper on the long, polished table. She took out an ink ingot and an ink stone, poured water into the ink stone, rolled up her sleeves, lifted her wrist, and slowly drew circles on the ink stone. Soon, the ink became thicker. Everything was left by the previous owner. Although it was not good, it was complete. Ning Ke was already waiting by the side with a brush in his hand. On the brush holder in front of his right hand, there were 5 or 6 brushes, the tip of which could not be seen clearly. The inferior ink did not have any fragrance when it melted, but had a slight odor. The brushes on the brush holder did not look good either, but he did not care about it. His face was full of an expectant smile, and he kept rubbing the thumb and index finger of his left hand behind his waist, as if itching. The so-called itching did not mean that he wanted to steal money, nor did he want to spank the little handmaiden's skinny butt. He just wanted to write. Ning Ke liked to write. Even if there was no paper, ink, brush, or inkstone beside him, but only a withered branch or a big black umbrella soaked in rain, he would write on the mud or bluestone from time to time. For the past 16 years, the enjoyment of writing was undoubtedly the most important thing in his life, along with meditation. Ning Ke dragged the brush into the ink slowly and absorbed enough ink until he was full of energy. Then he stood shoulder to shoulder, quietly looking at the roll of paper in front of him. He lifted the brush out of the inkstone like a sharp knife out of its sheath, and his pen fell into the paper like a knife cutting into the bone. With a slight movement of his wrist, a vertical line appeared on the paper. This vertical line was like a thick eyebrow of a big man with thick eyebrows. With the first touch of the broken paper, his pen's momentum paused and then mellowed. Over the years, the line of writing had already been deeply ingrained in his bone marrow and blood. He did not need to deliberately plan and manage it. He could naturally write on the paper as long as he casually did it. As the tip of the brush gradually moved to the left, a clumsy but free aura leaped out. The first piece of calligraphy he wrote in Chang and only had 16 words. The mountains are high and the rivers are long, and there are thousands of things. If I didn't have an old brush, I would be poor. Chapter 35. Ning Ke's ideal life was to have a good brush, ink, paper, inkstone and a beautiful knight, a beautiful handmaiden by his side, a cup of tea in front of him, 3 burning incense sticks by the table and a bright moon outside the window. He could roll up his sleeves to write as much as he wanted, and when he was done, he could raise his head and flick his fingers to send a handleless flying sword to kill a general from thousands of miles away. This was Ning Kei's ideal life. On the first night in the house on Lin 47th Street, he felt that he was infinitely close to his ideal. Although the brush, ink, paper and inkstone were all cheap goods, although the night was silent but not spacious, although there was only clear water without tea, only porridge and sesame seed cake on the table without burning incense, although there was still no bright moon outside the window, although the handmaiden was too small, too dark and too ugly, and although he now felt that cultivation was a very stinky and hollow fart, although there were so many ifs, he still felt very happy when he could write freely on the snow-white paper. He even thought that Song Song's idea of selling calligraphy was really a genius. The city of Wei was bitter and cold, not poor, but not rich either. The materials transported by the military ministry did not include brush, ink, paper and inkstone. Therefore, it used to cost a lot of money to write a few scrolls of calligraphy. Now, he could use the brush, ink, paper and inkstone freely and could even exchange them for money. Sang Sang would not complain in a low voice. Was there anything happier in the world? Painful and torturous time always passed like a year, but happy and enjoyable time was really fleeting. When he finally raised his head, picked up the bowl and drank half of the water, rubbed his sore wrists and shoulders, and decided to take a rest, it was already dawn outside the door. There was a faint sound of pouring water and hawking coming from afar. After writing for a whole night, there were already many scrolls of paper around him. Except for the 2 cursive works at the beginning to vent his emotions, he wrote the rest of the works honestly. He wrote what Sang Sang thought would sell well. It seemed that there was no plan, but in fact, there were vertical scrolls, horizontal scrolls, long scrolls and even a large central hall, but it had not been mounted yet. The scrolls of paper at the foot of the table seemed to be ink papers of different shapes and sizes. Ning Kei had practiced hard for many years and copied thousands of scrolls, so he was very confident in his handwriting. However, he could not use those skills that he was most confident and proud of in Chang and city. Otherwise, if the onlookers asked him which year was the 9 years of Yonghe and what was the Kuaiji Mountain, how could he answer them? Therefore, he could only copy some poetry collections from the present world, as well as some widely circulated scriptures. However, he believed that even so, after these scrolls of paper were hung on the wall, there would definitely be countless high-ranking officials, nobles, celebrities, and scholars with discerning eyes, who would come after hearing the news. Aya, the threshold will be broken in 2 days. Looks like we have to prepare for repairs in advance. Ning Kei thought proudly. He stretched his right hand to the wall and tore down the paper roll left by the former owner as if he was pulling out a pile of garbage. When he was about to ask Sang Sang to find a framing shop to hang up his masterpiece, he found that the little handmaiden had fallen asleep in the corner of the room, hugging her knees. I was just about to ask you to buy 2 bowls of Chang and's famous hot and sour noodles to try. He looked at the little lass who was sleeping soundly and couldn't help but shake his head. He took a short shirt and covered her body with it. Then, he pushed open the door and walked out. Under the comfortable morning light, he followed the alluring scent of green onions and the hawkers. Uncle, how much for a bowl of noodles? So expensive? Look, my shop is over there, and we are all neighbors. How about a cheaper price? Yes, that's the shop. I haven't named it yet. I've already thought of a name. I just need to make a signboard. What name? Old Brush Pen Shop. In order to get close to the hawker and buy 2 bowls of cheap hot and sour noodle soup, Ning Kei had randomly named the shop. This was somewhat unreasonable no matter how one looked at it. Therefore, Sang Sang had no idea about the shop's name, but she could not help mentioning her young master for several years because of this. All in all, this shop with a shopkeeper who was also a calligrapher, a handmaiden who was also a handyman, and such a strange name, had finally made its debut in Lin 47th Street. Ning Kei's only dissatisfaction with this shop was that it was too far from the framing shop, and framing was too slow. Unfortunately, he was not good at framing, so he had to wait patiently for another 2 days. One day, when it rained again in Chang'an, the shop on Lin 47th Street quietly opened for business. Ning Ke was wearing a brand new scholar's green robe, holding a cheap red clay teapot in his left hand. Standing behind the threshold in front of the wall full of books, he seemed to see a new life waving at him, and that new life was very handsome and pleasant. Spring rain is as precious as oil, a good sign. He sipped the tea, standing inside the threshold and looking at the wind and rain outside. He said with emotion, "The fragrance of tea and ink is intoxicating. It's really a grand undertaking. Talking and laughing is better than getting drunk in one's life." The young lad with a tender face was wearing a scholar's green robe, but he did not look handsome at all. Instead, he looked a little comical. Holding the teapot and acting old, he said such words in an old-fashioned tone, which made him look even more adorable. Someone was sheltering from the rain under the eaves outside the threshold and happened to hear Ning Ke's words. He subconsciously turned around and looked at Ning Quebec. After a slight shock, he could not help but laugh. It was a middle-aged man in a green robe with a sword casually tied to his side. His handsome eyes and brows were naturally free and easy, and his smile instantly brightened the rain outside the eaves. Ning Ke then realized that there was someone outside the threshold and knew that the man had heard his sour words. He could not help but feel a little embarrassed. He coughed twice and turned to look at the corner of the imperial palace in the distance, pretending that nothing had happened. The middle-aged man was probably a little bored. He turned around and walked into the shop. He casually looked around the wall with his hands behind his back. His eyes showed admiration and surprise, but it seemed that he did not want to take out money. As the saying goes, a scholar should always have some vigor. Ning Ke was too lazy to greet the customer, even though the man was the first customer since the opening of the old brush pen shop and had a deep historical significance. After looking around, the middle-aged man walked back to Ning Ke and said with a smile, "Little boss." Before he could finish his sentence, Ning Ke corrected him with a smile, "Please call me boss. Don't call me little boss just because I look young. Just like I won't call you swordsman just because you carry a sword. Alright, little boss." The middle-aged man did not change the way he addressed Ning Quebec. He said with a smile, "I really want to know why you are willing to rent this shop that no one has been willing to rent for 3 months. Ning Ke replied, "It's a quiet place with a good environment. I have no reason not to rent it." The middle-aged man smiled slightly and said, "I just want to remind you that the reason why this shop has not been rented out even though it's so cheap is not that other people are dumber than you. It's because the warehouse of the shipping department of the Ministry of Revenue is going to be expanded. The Chang'an local government has always wanted to take back the shops on this street. You know that the compensation given by the local government is very little. It's too risky to rent a shop here, and you may lose everything at any time. You said it's quiet here, but didn't you notice that the shops on the side are all closed?" Ning Ke slightly frowned and looked at the man, asking, "Why do you know these things?" The middle-aged man calmly replied, "Because the shops on both sides of this street are all mine." Chapter 36. When the shop opened, the first customer was the owner who was qualified to collect the rent. It did not seem to be a good sign. Ning Ke's mood did not become too bad after hearing such a troublesome insider news. He believed that a man who could own an entire street in Chang'an was either rich or had a powerful backer. Since the owner had made a promise to him, it was unnecessary for him to worry about other things. Since the old brush pen shop was the only tenant on this street, the middle-aged man generously said that he would waive the rent for 3 months before he left. That alone was enough to make the master and the servant happy. What really troubled him was the business that was as miserable as a cold spring breeze. The spring rain in Chang'an lasted for 4 or 5 days in a row, pitter-patter, as if there was no end to it. The air was cold and the road was wet and slippery, so people were naturally reluctant to go out. Now, only his shop was open on this long street. The doors of the shops in the front and back of the street were tightly closed, so there was no way for people to gather. Therefore, it seemed more and more deserted. Apart from 2 or 3 groups of people, there were only a few sparrows jumping on their little feet. How could there be any business? On the first day of opening, Ning Kei had always said that the spring rain was as precious as oil, but now it had become as cheap as urine. He sat on a round chair with a long ledge and looked at the rain outside the shop, sighing again and again. If a person's gaze could really have power, and if he was a grand cultivator or psyche master who had entered the knowing destiny state, his resentful gaze was enough to directly tear down the grey wall. The middle-aged man said that both sides of Lin 47th Street were his shops, but not the grey wall opposite the old brush pen shop. Behind that grey wall was the warehouse of the Ministry of Personnel, which needed to be expanded. That was one of the reasons why Ning Kei was unhappy. At noon, someone finally stepped into the deserted shop. It was a fat man with a big belly who looked like a rich businessman and 2 attendants. Ning Kei had thought that they had ill intentions and might be black-faced lobbyists hired by the Imperial Demolition Department, so he inevitably became vigilant. After listening to a few words, he realized that they were just 2 idlers who were taking a stroll to hide from the rain. Since they were idlers, Ning Kei naturally did not bother to get up to greet them. He held the teapot of poor quality red clay in both hands and looked at the curtain of rain outside the shop. His eyes were slightly open as if he was about to fall asleep, but in fact, his heart was already swollen from wanting to make money. The fat tycoon put his hands behind his back and put his face close to the wall to look carefully. For some unknown reason, the few people who entered the old brush pen shop these days habitually put their hands behind their backs, as if they wanted to show that they had good eyesight. The rich man had lived in Chang'an for a long time. He had been an artsy person for many years, so he had developed some discerning eyes. After looking for a while, he said to the attendant beside him, "You don't say. I can't believe there are some good words in such a shabby place." This sentence should be regarded as a compliment, but it seemed a little frivolous and condescending. Of course, such a tone could not arouse the feelings of Ning Kei's bosom friend. He still sat in the round chair, seemingly unconcerned, but in fact, his ears were pricked up, carefully listening to what this rich man would say next, hoping to sell the first piece of calligraphy. "Young man, who wrote these words in the shop?" the fat millionaire turned around and asked. "I wrote it." Ning Kei leaned forward slightly and responded politely. The fat millionaire did not say anything more. After looking for a while, he shook his head and sighed regretfully, "Tsk. What a pity, what a pity. There are a few pieces of calligraphy that can be called beautiful, but it's a pity that the writer is still young and forced himself to pretend to be a great calligrapher. Well, since you can see it today, you're lucky. San-air, take down this piece of calligraphy, I want it." Ning Kei turned to the 3 people and asked, "Sir, how much do you want to pay for it?" "This piece of calligraphy can be sold for at most 500 copper coins in a stall outside the fragrance workshop. Since you have the shop's fees, and since you're young, I'll give you 2 taels of silver." The rich man said with a smile. Ning Kei picked up the teapot and drank some tea, then put it down and scolded, "Get lost." The rich man's expression suddenly changed, and he scolded angrily, "Young man, how can you not know how to appreciate favors? I'm young, but I can't be bullied." Ning Kei shook his head and replied, "When you said that I was young and forced myself to pretend to be a great calligrapher, I was ready to ask you to get lost. I just wanted to see what your price was. If your price was high enough, I don't mind letting you humiliate me. But it's a pity that your price is not enough to humiliate me." The livid rich man flicked his sleeves and left with his entourage. Sang Sang, who had rolled up her sleeves and was washing vegetables, rushed out of the backyard. Looking at the 3 figures that had long disappeared in the rain, her face was full of regret and unwillingness. She twisted her body and stared at Ning Kai, who was sitting in the chair, and said angrily, "Young master, that's 2 taels of silver." The sale of 2 ingots of ink and 3 pieces of writing paper was all the income of the old brush pen shop since its opening. Although the middle-aged man had waived their rent for 3 months, Sang Sang could not sleep well every night when she thought of the terrible expenses of the academy in the future. No wonder she was so angry about the previous scene. Since there was no more business, Ning Kai simply closed the shop after lunch, in the name of comforting the little handmaiden's seriously hurt heart. In fact, he probably just wanted to relax himself. He took Sang Sang through the streets and alleys to the legendary Chenjinji cosmetics store, and then bought some leisure books from a bookstore called Donghua Bookstore. The effect of relaxing was very good. Sang Sang carried the Tide books in one hand and the powder box of Chenjinji cosmetics store in the other. Her tanned face could not hide her joy. Ning Kai was also in a very good mood. He held the big black umbrella with his right hand and stretched out his left hand to catch the rainwater. The rainwater hit the umbrella in his palm, and his boots stepped on the rainwater that had accumulated into small puddles. The master and the handmaiden hopped back to Lin 47th Street like 2 little sparrows. Suddenly, the black umbrella shook slightly. Ning Kai stood in the rain a dozen meters away from the shop and looked at the gray wall that had been washed black by the rainwater. He looked at the man sitting under the wall, and at the man's tanned face that had turned blue due to excessive blood loss. His right hand holding the handle of the umbrella suddenly tightened. The sound was like the beating of a war drum. His left foot suddenly stepped into the puddle on the bluestone, splashing water. He gathered all the strength in his body to his waist and was ready to rush down the gray wall. However, at this moment, the black-faced man covered in blood under the wall looked at him and forced a smile. Then he shook his head with unusual firmness. There was an extremely terrible wound on his chest and abdomen. His black clothes were torn, blood was flowing, and his bones were broken. Even those grand cultivators who had entered the state of no rules could not save him. Ning Kai saw this scene and understood his determination. Then he heard the dense footsteps and shouts from the entrance of the alley. So he slowly and clumsily withdrew his left foot, and his right hand holding the handle of the umbrella trembled violently for no reason. The military ministry is chasing the spy. Idlers, get out of the way. Dozens of Tang Yulan royal guards in full armor rushed into the alley in the rain and surrounded Joyer under the corner of the wall. They looked solemn and vigilant. The leading general was obviously relieved when he saw Joyer's injury. The spring rain was getting heavier and heavier, washing the gray wall even darker. The rainwater flowed down the wall like a stream and quickly washed away the blood stained by Joyer. Chapter 37. The Yulan royal guards had sealed off the Lin 47th Street, but more and more people of Chang'an were crowding around. They didn't care about the cold rain drenching their bodies. They looked at the black-faced man under the wall nervously, uneasily, excitedly, or pitifully, and guessed what had happened. Ning Kai stood in the rain with a black umbrella and looked at Joyer, who was sitting in the rain, through the crowd. His expression was calm and he looked very focused, as if he wanted to engrave that face in his mind forever. 7 years ago, when we met on Min Mountain, this face was already so dark. Why are you so dark? Darker than the bottom of a pot, darker than Sang Sang, and darker than the night. They hadn't seen each other for 7 years, but little Darky had become a black-faced man. After all, this face was still a little strange. So at this last moment, he had to look at it seriously and remember it firmly. Joyer, whose eyes were always closed, was carried out of Lin 47th Street by the sergeants of the Yulan royal guards. The onlookers dispersed, and Ning Kai and Sang Sang walked back to the shop under the black umbrella. He looked calm, but Sang Sang could clearly feel that there was no light in his eyes, as if he was a shell without a soul. After the shop door was closed, Ning Kei sat in the armchair and kept silent for a long time. Then he said in a low voice, "Let's have noodles tonight." "Okay." Sang Sang answered as fast as she could. She threw the book and makeup box aside and went into the backyard. After eating a bowl of noodles with 3 fried eggs specially made by Sang Sang, Ning Kei's mood seemed to have completely returned to normal. He even made fun of her after putting down the bowl and chopsticks, but his laughter was inevitably a little dry. In the dead of night, when the rain stopped, Ning Kei walked out of the shop. After making sure that no one was watching in the dark, he slowly walked to the gray wall opposite the shop and squatted down. He raised his arm and slowly stroked the wall. That guy's body temperature had long disappeared from the damp and cold wall. He didn't know why that guy came here when he was seriously injured and on the verge of death, what he wanted to tell him, how long he had waited in the cold rain, and what he was thinking when he waited. His slender fingers touched a brick and slightly froze. There was a very faint blood stain on the corner of the brick, as well as a very small mark. If he didn't touch it with his fingers, he would never be able to see it with his naked eyes. Walking back to the shop, Ning Kei handed a few pieces of thin paper soaked in oil to Sang Sang and told her to take good care of them. Then, he boiled a pot of water and scalded his feet. Then, he crawled into the damp and cool quilt. As usual, Sang Sang slept on the other side of the bed, curled up like a mouse. 7 years ago, I only stayed with him for a dozen days before he was taken away by his dead master. However, you don't remember those things. He didn't learn anything from that dead man all these years, and now he's just a spy for the military. He's not doing very well. We did exchange letters, but we only met again after 7 years. I don't know what kind of person he has become. It would be too pretentious to say that I have deep feelings for him. My relationship with him is one of mutual use. To be more precise, I used him to find out about Xia Ho's matters. But he died just like that. This is very troublesome. I'm the only one who knows about the massacre of those villages. Of course, I didn't count you in. Doesn't that mean that I'm the one responsible for it? But now I'm already in a lot of trouble. How can I have the energy to care about this? Sang Sang knew that he just needed to vent or convince himself. He didn't need anyone to talk to him, so she didn't speak and gradually fell asleep. Ning Kei couldn't fall asleep. He opened his eyes and looked at the stains formed by the rainwater in the corner of the room. Suddenly, he sat up, put on a thin cotton jacket and went to the small courtyard. He took out 3 old knives from the pile of firewood and lowered his head to sharpen them under the eaves of the well. After sharpening the knives, he still didn't feel sleepy. He walked to the shop and lit the lamp. He poured water to grind the ink and moistened the brush. Then, he tore a piece of paper at random and wrote a few lines of words with the ink splashing like the heavy rain in the daytime. Chasing is too cruel. My name is Mu Ju. The pain penetrates my heart and liver. The pain is unbearable. Unable to get the Mercedes-Benz, the sorrow deepens. Choking on the paper, I don't know what to say. Little Ning, I bow my head. There was no expression on Ning Kei's face. His eyes were calm, which formed a sharp contrast with the gradually bitter and agitated handwriting on the paper. Sang Sang didn't know when she got up from the bed. The little handmaiden stood beside him in a thin cotton jacket. She looked at the words silently and then raised her little face to look at him in doubt. These words were written by a predecessor. I'm just copying. Ning Kei explained that predecessor's ancestral grave was dug up. Although it was restored immediately, he couldn't go back to see it. So he wrote these words in grief and anger. Sang Sang nodded, but judging from the perplexed look in her eyes, she probably still did not understand. Ning Kei smiled and did not explain further. He had copied this famous piece at least 10 times. Only tonight did he roughly understand what kind of pain could pierce through his heart and liver, and what kind of things could make people choke with emotions and not know what to say at the last moment. After daybreak, the rain stopped. The sun that had been washed by the spring rain was extraordinarily clear and beautiful. It shone on the quiet Lin 47th Street, painting all the eaves and the grey wall with a layer of beauty. The door of the old brush pen shop was wide open. Ning Kei sat in a round chair and read a leisurely book. Sometimes he frowned or smiled because of the contents of the book, and then he picked up the teapot and took a sip of tea. There was a piece of oil-soaked paper in the middle of the seemingly leisurely book. The words that would never be wet by the rain were very clear in the oil-soaked paper. He wasn't reading the book at this time, but he was looking at the paper. This piece of oil-soaked paper was stuffed into the brick before Joyer died. It recorded a few names and some information such as their whereabouts and hobbies. Ning Kei didn't know whether this paper had anything to do with Joyer's death. But at least he knew what he should do to make Joyer's death worthwhile or to make him happier after death. The first name on the oil-soaked paper was Zhang Yiqi. Zhang Yiqi was an assistant censor of the Imperial Censorate. He was responsible for inspecting the officials and impeaching those who violated the law. When Censor Zhang was still a supervising censor, he was responsible for the trial of Xianwei General Lin Guanyuan's treason. When he was promoted to the secretary of the Imperial Censorate, he was also one of the officials who investigated the village extermination case in the Yan territory. Rising from the 8th rank to the lower 6th rank in 13 years didn't seem like a good official career. But Ning Kei didn't care about this. He only cared about the role this person played in the two cases. General Xiahou could kill the enemy and get away from the village extermination case. This person obviously played the role of an imperial censor. Then, you should die. Chapter 38. The censorate's rank was not high, but its power was not small. The imperial censor of the 6th rank was considered an important figure in the Tang Empire's bureaucratic system. The places where such a person went in and out were heavily guarded. Whether it was the government office or the mansion, there would be many subordinates and guards around them. A poor young man who wanted to kill a censor in Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Empire, sounded like a fantasy. Moreover, it was a fantasy from the East, which was used to individual heroism. However, Ning Kei had never considered how to kill the censor. In his opinion, killing was the simplest thing in the world. His life began with a murder. Later, in the Min Mountain, the frontier fortress, the grassland, and the northern mountain road, countless beasts and humans fell under his blades and arrows. He only cared about one thing at the moment: how to kill the censor Zhang Yiqi without being discovered. No matter how much he trusted his killing skills, he knew that if he could not escape quickly, he would definitely die in front of the security yamen of the Tang Empire and the unfathomable powerhouses in Chang'an. There was very little information about Zhang Yiqi on the oil paper, which was not suitable for Ning Kei's plan, except for one: the censor, Zhang Yiqi, was a serious and upright person. However, it was said that he was secretly very lecherous and often visited brothels. However, he had a fierce wife and carried the censor's reputation, so he was very careful when he visited brothels. After all, Joyer was only a low-level spy in the military ministry. He had never found out which brothel he frequented. There are so many brothels in Chang'an. Which one would you go to? Ning Kei furrowed his brows and pondered hard. He discarded the idea of following the other party to the brothel. Since the professional spies of the military ministry could not find out where Zhang Yiqi's brothel was, this censor must have his own way of finding out. And the people of Chang'an who loved to chat in the tea-houses would not care much about the preferences of an official like him. Therefore, it was difficult for him to get what he wanted from the streets and alleys. Things had become a little troublesome. Propping up his chin, he stared blankly at the clear sun after the rain for a long time. Suddenly, he stood up. At this moment, he was suddenly enlightened. He finally understood that this matter was no different from hunting in the Min Mountain or chopping firewood in the grassland. Since he wanted to know where the old bear and the horse gang were, but there was no good hunter-general to provide him with a map, the only thing he could do was to walk into the Min Mountain and the grassland with his own feet. He could see the worn marks on the bark, the dried feces in the weeds, and the ashes of the bonfire buried under the mud. He was a good hunter and an excellent woodchopper. Through these details, he was able to determine where the old bear was hiding and whether it had been injured. He was able to determine how many horse gang members there were and whether they had left Shubi Lake. Then he believed that he would be able to determine the habits of a Tang censor through the details he had personally observed and find a way to kill him silently. What he needed to do now was to enter Chang'an City. "I'm going out for a walk." Ning Kai stretched himself and said to Sang Sang. Then he walked out. Sang Sang ran to the door and asked, "Where are you going? Do you want me to go with you?" Ning Kai understood what she was worried about. He answered with a smile, "There are some places that you can't go with me." Walking on the sunny streets of Chang'an, Ning Kai's mood became better. He deliberately forgot about the blood in the spring rain, and then turned himself into a young scholar traveling abroad to study. He first went to the bookstore to return the few books that he had finished reading, and then began to wander between the censorate and the Zhang mansion. The next day, he walked under the shade of the willow tree and stood beside the sugar figurine stall. He watched from afar through the crowd as the square-faced, majestic censor walked out of the censorate and returned to his own mansion. Looking at the censor's strong entourage, the well-disciplined public security army in the streets, and the Yulin Royal Guards cavalry that occasionally galloped past him, Ning Kai was more and more certain that he could not use such a reckless method as killing people on the street. The whole day seemed to be fruitless. In the evening, the door of the Zhang mansion opened. The censor seemed to be attending an official banquet. The censor's wife and a few women dressed as concubines saw him off. The idlers on the street laughed and pointed at the place and said envious words. Ning Kai, who was drinking herbal tea in the tea shop, noticed some details. Apart from the cold and skinny wife, the other concubines were all extremely plump. Men's taste for women was never reflected through their wives, but through their concubines or lovers. Sometimes, men married because of their family status, money, prospects, and maybe love. But the reason why they took in concubines or lovers was very simple. It was purely to match their sexual desires. "I like plump girls." Ning Kai smiled and thought to himself as he looked at the concubines who stood obediently behind their mistress like quails. Their eyes revealed pride and slyness from time to time. Following the censor's sedan chair for 4 streets, Ning Kai watched as the sedan chair entered a majestic prince's mansion. He quietly looked at the door of the prince's mansion, then turned around and walked to a crowded place. He found an idler and asked, "My friend, I want to know if there are any brothels in Chang'an and where the girls are known for their plump bodies." This question was very stupid, but after handing over a piece of silver, even the stupidest question could get a not-so-stupid answer. In the eyes of the idler, Ning Kai suddenly became a rich and tender scholar who came to Chang'an from another place. After making fun of him, Ning Kai held the teapot and introduced the brothels in Chang'an to him with great professionalism. Hearing the names that were even more complicated than the academy entrance examination, Ning Kai rubbed his eyebrows and said with a bitter smile, "There are too many. Say, which ones are the most expensive? And the environment must be quiet." Holding the names and addresses of a few famous brothels, Ning Kai searched the brightly lit streets of Chang'an. He lingered and hesitated in those romantic places. He did not enter some of the brothels. Just by looking at the appearance and the surrounding environment, he was sure that the censor was definitely not a regular customer. This was purely a hunter's intuition. The problem was that he was really not good at hunting in such places. He felt a little embarrassed that he did not enter the brothels after being politely invited by the pimps at the entrance. When he walked to the fourth brothel on the list, he realized that his method was not only stupid, but extremely stupid. There were so many brothels in Chang'an, and the environment was quiet and elegant. Which brothel did not have plump and popular girls? Wouldn't the chances of bumping into that old bear be too low if he were to recklessly bump into it like a blind bear? When he lingered outside the brothel for a while and turned to leave, he suddenly heard a silver bell-like voice behind him. The clear laughter floated far away on Chang'an Street, attracting the attention of countless people. Ning Kei suddenly turned around and saw that the brothel was brightly lit. The ladies who had not yet started work were leaning against the railings and laughing. Their red sleeves were waving wildly, as if they were teasing a young man who was too shy to enter. What a bully! He weighed the heavy silver bag in his sleeve and looked at the beautiful prostitutes who were smiling seductively upstairs. He made up his mind, raised his head, lifted the front of his scholar's robe, and walked into his new era in high spirits. Chapter 39. The purpose of entering the brothel was to investigate Zhang Yiqi's whereabouts, to avenge Shu'er, to seek justice for the villagers who were slaughtered in the Yan territory, and to seek justice for all the people who died in the general's mansion. Ning Kei walked into the brothel with these thoughts in mind. Then, he sincerely realized that these excuses were bullshit. If he insisted on this view, Darky would definitely come back from the underworld covered in rain and give him a hard kick. Thinking of these things and the fact that he was about to open a new chapter in his life, he was very nervous. After entering the brothel, he realized that he did not see the signboard outside clearly. In fact, there was no signboard in the brothel at all. Under the attentive greeting of two manservants, he walked through a small courtyard and into the brightly lit building. Casually glancing at the lobby of the brothel, Ning Kei's expression was as calm as usual, but he was a little surprised. He found that the brothel looked lively and cheerful outside, but it was very quiet inside. It was very different from other brothels. Of course, he had never been to a brothel. But when he brought Sang Sang to cure her illness and bought the article on the response of the Tao, he had seen the brothel from afar in Chongping. More accurately, this brothel was very different from what he had imagined. The lobby was brightly lit, and the music was clear but not obscene. On the red carpet in the middle, several slender women were plucking the strings of the zither. Their expressions were focused on the instruments, and there was gentleness in their beautiful eyes. However, they did not cast any flirtatious glances at the customers below the stage. Entering the lobby, the whole world seemed to be quiet. The voices of the girls in the brothel who were leaning against the railing and waving their red sleeves to make fun of him became extremely distant and inaudible. But then, there was a burst of light footsteps upstairs. Ning Kei guessed that it must be those girls who rushed here to see him. He hurriedly lowered his head to hide the embarrassment on his face. The manservant softly asked him what service he needed. He did not show any disrespect just because he was young and the target of the girls' teasing. Ning Kei pinched the silver pouch in his sleeve and secretly guessed that the dozens of taels of silver he stole from Sang Sang were probably useless in this world. So he randomly pointed to a table in the corner. A pot of sake, 2 plates of melon seeds and nuts, 4 plates of sweet pastries, and a hot and cold towel. Even the small bucket for the shells of the melon seeds was very beautiful with red plum blossoms between the black lacquer. It was very beautiful. All these added up cost Ning Kei 4 taels of silver. But he did not feel wronged at all. Because the service and luxurious furnishings here were all luxurious for a child who had been living in the frontier fortress for many years, he had never experienced anything like this before. After drinking 2 cups of wine and eating a few fruits, the music on the stage changed to dancing. The naked bodies wrapped in light robes spun and jumped with the music. White skin appeared when they raised their hands and tight curves could be seen when they moved their feet. The previously quiet atmosphere in the lobby also became warm and ambiguous. The customers at the tables in the hall were all surrounded by girls with charming smiles and gentle eyes. At this time, the atmosphere was like night, so the distance between men and women naturally became closer. They snuggled up to each other, and occasionally, they would take a sip. As for the softness of the hands that were hidden in the wide sleeves, no one knew. Perhaps it was because the rules of this building were strict, but there were no overly intimate scenes that appeared. But in this way, Ning Kei, who was sitting alone in the corner, suddenly seemed a little out of tune with the atmosphere. He was alone without a girl by his side, and it was really a little awkward in such a place. Especially when the girls who were teasing him by the railings upstairs laughed again, and the girls who were in the arms of the customers even looked at him with mischievous and interesting eyes from time to time, the awkwardness became a little extreme. But in this way, Ning Kei, who was sitting alone in the corner, suddenly seemed a little out of tune with the atmosphere. He was alone without a girl by his side, and it was really a little embarrassing in such a place. Especially when the girls who were teasing him by the railings upstairs laughed again, and the girls who were in the arms of the customers even looked at him with mischievous and interesting eyes from time to time, the awkwardness became a little extreme. The Tangs were open-minded and generous, and liked to have fun. They were also the most warm-hearted. It was common for them to meet in a brothel and drink together at the table. Ning Kei was slightly stunned by the invitation, but he did not want to lose his bearing. He cupped his hands and bowed sincerely, and then let the servant carry his slightly shabby wine in dishes over. There was no such thing as introducing each other as soon as they met in a brothel. As the saying went, there was no need to know each other when they met in the same place. The young man did not ask who Ning Kei was, but just kept drinking and laughing. Ning Kei also relaxed after drinking a few more cups of wine. He was also a very talkative and noisy person, so he responded with a few words, and suddenly the table became lively. The young man seemed to be in a very good mood. He squinted his eyes and looked at Ning Kei with bad intentions. He said to the steward generously, "Arrange 2 girls for this young man. It doesn't matter their age, or where they are from, as long as they know how to serve people." Ning Kei thought to himself that age was not a problem, and nationality was not a problem. He did not think that the people in Chang'an would have such an unrestrained discussion. While he was laughing there, he suddenly understood what the young man meant. He could not help but be shocked, and hurriedly waved his hands to say that there was no need. Indeed, there is no need to be polite. The young man laughed in a low voice, and his laughter was very unusual. "Young man, if I am not wrong, you should still be a virgin, right?" Ning Kei frowned awkwardly, and the few inconspicuous freckles on his cheeks suddenly became obvious. He thought to himself, should I bow to him at this time, and then shout, "Brother, you really have a good eye." The steward squinted his eyes and smiled, and said, "Don't worry," and then turned to make arrangements. Seeing the strange expression on Ning Kei's face, the young man could not help but slightly frown and guess, "Young man, could it be that you don't like mature women who care for you at your age, and only like delicate young ladies?" Ning Kei sat at the table like a piece of wood, and his eyes were wandering. No one knew what he was thinking. Suddenly, he made up his mind, and said with a shy smile, "To be honest, I still like girls of the same age as me." "Good, good, good, this is the nature of a man, frank and unrestrained." The young man patted his fan and praised, and then immediately raised his eyebrows and laughed, "You are a young man, and if you want girls of the same age, they must be new. I did not expect you to like this kind of people." Ning Kei slightly raised his eyebrows, and when he was about to talk about the hundreds of times of life he had accumulated over the years, suddenly a little maidservant ran down the stairs, and expressionlessly walked to their table, and said in a clear voice, "Young man, Mistress Jian wants to see you." Ning Kei was about to enter a new era with the help of a kind young man, but suddenly a little maidservant came to interrupt him. Ning Kei slightly opened his mouth, and instantly thought of countless plots in legends. Every time the male protagonists went to the brothel in high spirits, they would always be interrupted by one or another accident, and those accidents included the brothel being burned down, the battle of the strong, his childhood sweetheart being jealous, or the sudden appearance of the fierce wife at home. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel very nervous, and even began to feel depressed in advance. He did not even think about who Mistress Jian was. However, when the guests at the hall heard the name of Mistress Jian, they suddenly showed surprise and confusion, and all looked at him with envy and even jealousy. The young man was stunned, and then patted Ning Kei's shoulder with jealousy, and said with a laugh, "You are so lucky." Ning Kei was awakened by the heavy slap with deep resentment, and then he noticed the expressions on the faces of the people in the hall. After a slight shock, he could not help but have a strong curiosity about Mistress Jian, and of course, many beautiful reverie. You're tuning into the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.